She sat at the most expensive table in New York, surrounded by men making billion-dollar decisions, and not one of them knew her name. The air inside Ethelard was not merely conditioned, it was curated. It tasted of old money and the kind of ruthless, quiet power that never needed to raise its voice. Heavy damask curtains, the color of dried blood, swallowed the sounds of the Manhattan streets outside, creating a silence so complete it felt like being entombed. The only sounds that dared exist were the discreet clink of sterling silver on bone china and the low murmur of conversations, where fortunes changed hands over seared foie gras and bottles of wine that cost more than most people earned in a month. This was not a restaurant. This was a temple to wealth, and tonight, at Table 7, the most secluded alcove with its commanding view of the private garden, a ritual was taking place. A sacrifice, really, though the woman at the center of it did not yet fully understand that she was the one being offered up. Sophie Nakamura Sterling had not spoken a single word in 93 minutes. She had counted them. Each minute ticked past in the elegant grandfather clock standing sentry near the entrance. 93 minutes of sitting perfectly still, while men who had never bothered to learn her name discussed the dismantling of her grandfather's legacy as if she were not even present, as if she were a piece of furniture, a decorative element, an ornament placed at the table for aesthetic purposes only. Her posture was perfect. Years of her mother's training ensured that. Shoulders back but not rigid. Hands folded in her lap, not on the table. Eyes downcast in what might have looked like deference, but was actually something closer to survival. She had learned long ago that stillness was a kind of armor. If she did not move, did not draw attention, perhaps they would forget she was there and say something true. Something she could use. But they had not forgotten she was there. They simply did not care. Sophie's fingers found the small pin on her lapel. It was an unconscious gesture, a nervous habit she had developed over the past 2 weeks. The crane and moon pin, her grandfather's first creation. A delicate piece of metalwork showing an abstract crane in flight against a perfect circle of mother of pearl. The moon. She traced the crane's wing with her thumb, feeling the minute grooves in the gold inlay. It was the only thing keeping her tethered to this moment, to this room, to her own body. The Dover sole arrived. She had not ordered it. Marcus Blackwell had ordered it for her without asking, without even glancing in her direction. He had simply announced to the waiter, "The lady will have the Dover sole," as if her preferences were his to dictate, as if she did not have a voice of her own. She hated fish. The smell of it reminded her of suffocation, of drowning. But she would eat it. She would cut it into small, precise pieces. She would bring each piece to her mouth with perfect posture. She would chew exactly 20 times before swallowing, just as her mother had taught her. And she would do all of this while maintaining the small, tight smile she had perfected over the course of 30 years of being caught between two worlds and fully belonging to neither. The smile that said, "I am gracious, I am accommodating, I will not make trouble." The smile that was slowly killing her from the inside. Marcus Blackwell sat at the head of the table as if it were his throne. He was a man carved from granite and cynicism, all sharp angles and cold authority. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, not a strand out of place. His suit was Savile Row, custom-tailored to emphasize the shoulders that had metaphorically carried an empire for 40 years. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, pale blue, and utterly without warmth. When he looked at you, it was with the detached assessment of a man calculating value, and Sophie, apparently, had very little. He had introduced himself to her exactly once, at the beginning of the evening. "Miss Nakamura Sterling." Not a question, a statement, an acknowledgement of her existence that lasted precisely 3 seconds before he turned his attention to the men who actually mattered. To his right sat his son Brandon. Where Marcus was granite, Brandon was polished steel. Sleeker, more modern, but just as hard. He wore his Italian suit like armor, and his predatory smile like a weapon. Throughout the dinner, he had directed questions about Nakamura Corporation's financials to his own team, speaking over Sophie as if she were simply not there. When he did glance in her direction, it was with a look that lingered just a moment too long, assessing her not as a business partner, but as an exotic curiosity. A pretty half-Japanese girl playing at being important. And then there was Victoria Chen, the chief legal counsel for Sterling Whitmore. She had a razor-sharp bob that did not move when she turned her head, and a mind that could dissect a contract with surgical precision. She spoke in crisp, emotionless clauses, her focus entirely on the thick sheaf of documents resting beside her untouched appetizer. To Victoria, Sophie was simply the final signature needed on the dotted line, a formality, an obstacle to be managed and then forgotten. For 93 minutes, Sophie had been invisible. The flashback hit her without warning, triggered by the smell of the Dover sole being placed in front of her. Fish. Her father loved fish. 2 weeks ago, the hospital room had smelled of antiseptic and failure. Her father, James Sterling, lay in the adjustable bed, his left side paralyzed from the massive stroke that had ambushed him in his office. The doctor said he was lucky to be alive. Sophie was not sure her father agreed. She had been holding his trembling right hand, the only one that still worked, when he managed to speak. His words came out slurred, labored, each syllable a battle against a body that no longer obeyed him. "Protect," he had whispered, his eyes desperate and pleading. "Protect what, Dad?" Sophie leaned closer, her heart breaking at how small he looked in that bed. This man who had always seemed larger than life, who had bridged two worlds with his charisma and his unshakable confidence, now reduced to broken words. The heart. His fingers squeezed hers with what little strength he had left. Your grandfather's heart. She did not understand. "What do you mean?" "The crane." A tear slipped down his cheek, and Sophie had to fight not to cry herself. "The crane flies both ways. Don't let them—" He struggled for breath. "Don't let them erase him." The next day, the board of directors had called an emergency meeting. Sophie had sat in the same conference room where her grandfather used to hold court, where he used to speak about art and technology as two sides of the same coin, inseparable and sacred. But Hiroshi Nakamura was gone now, dead for 5 years. And the men who had replaced him on the board did not share his vision. They presented the Sterling Whitmore offer as if it were a done deal. A merger, they called it, though Sophie knew enough about corporate language to understand that merger was just a polite word for acquisition, for takeover, for the slow, methodical erasure of everything her grandfather had built. She had tried to protest. Grandfather would never have agreed to this. The foundation alone. Your father already agreed to the terms. The chairman had cut her off with the bored efficiency of a man swatting a fly. "It's done, Miss Sterling. Your presence at the final dinner is, of course, appreciated. A courtesy to honor your grandfather's legacy." A courtesy. The word had landed like a slap. She was not there because her opinion mattered. She was there because they needed a Nakamura at the table for appearances. They needed her signature. But they did not need her voice. And now here she was, sitting in this suffocating room, watching men dismantle her grandfather's life's work while she cut Dover's soul into perfect tiny pieces and said nothing at all. Sophie had spent her entire life caught between two identities, never fully accepted by either. In Tokyo, at her mother's family gatherings, she had been the American girl, too tall, too direct, her Japanese formal but lacking the nuance of someone truly born to it. In New York, at her father's business functions, she had been the Japanese one, exotic, decorative, interesting for about 5 minutes before the conversation moved on to people who really mattered. Her father had tried to teach her to be assertive, to speak up, to take up space the way American businessmen did. Her mother had taught her the art of graceful silence, of reading a room, of knowing when stillness was more powerful than speech. For 30 years, Sophie had tried to balance these two opposing forces, to be the bridge her parents wanted her to be. Tonight, the silence was winning. The assertiveness her father had tried to instill in her was buried under the weight of 93 minutes of being ignored. She thought about her mother, dead now for 10 years. Would she be proud of this graceful silence? Or would she be disappointed that her daughter had learned the wrong lesson? Her mother had wielded silence like a blade, strategic and precise. Sophie's silence was not strategic. It was surrender. Her fingers found the crane and moonpin again. She remembered the day her grandfather had given it to her mother. Sophie had been 7 years old, sitting in his workshop, watching him put the final polish on the piece, the crane in flight, the moon below, two opposing forces in perfect balance. "When you do not know whether to fly or stay," he had told her mother in Japanese, his voice gentle and wise, "you must learn to do both. The crane visits the moon, but it always returns to the reeds. Ambition and community, achievement and connection. This is the secret to a meaningful life." Her mother had worn that pin every day until she died. And then it had passed to Sophie, a reminder of a philosophy she understood in theory, but had never managed to live. Across the room, moving between tables with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from years of invisible labor, was a waitress. Sophie had noticed her earlier, though she could not have said exactly why. There was something in the woman's eyes, a sharpness, an intelligence that seemed at odds with the subservient posture and the plain black uniform. The waitress moved like someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. Her steps were economical, her gestures precise. She refilled water glasses without being asked, cleared plates without making a sound, anticipated needs before they were spoken. In the hierarchy of this place, she was even lower than Sophie. At least Sophie had a seat at the table. This woman was furniture that could walk. Elena Torres had been a waitress at Ethelard for 5 years. In the informal parliament of the staff, she was what they called a lifer. The others came and went, using the job as a stepping stone to something better, burning out under the demanding hours and the casual cruelty of the clientele. But Elena stayed. The other servers could not understand why. The pay was decent but not extraordinary. The tips were good on the high-end tables, but those tables were rare. Most nights were spent serving people who looked through you as if you did not exist, who snapped their fingers for service, who complained about everything and tipped like misers. But Elena stayed because she was waiting. For what, she could not have said exactly. A sign, an opportunity, a reason to believe that the 5 years she had spent being invisible would eventually mean something. She had perfected the art of invisibility. It was a kind of armor, a survival mechanism. If you did not draw attention, you did not get yelled at. If you anticipated needs before they were spoken, you became part of the background. Efficient, forgettable, safe. But invisibility came with a cost. After 5 years, Elena sometimes caught herself in the mirror and did not recognize the woman staring back. The weariness in her eyes, the lines around her mouth from holding professional smiles for hours at a time, the way she had learned to make herself small, to fold her intelligence away like a napkin and tuck it somewhere no one would ever see it. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, Table 7 had her attention in a way that made her uneasy. Elena had served dictators and disgraced politicians and tech billionaires who had made their fortunes destroying other people's companies. She had learned to read people the way a scholar reads ancient texts, finding meaning in the smallest gestures, the unspoken tensions, the power dynamics that played out in who spoke and who stayed silent. And tonight, watching Table 7, she saw something that made her chest tighten with an old, familiar anger. The young woman at the table was drowning. Elena saw it in the rigidity of her shoulders, the way they carried a weight that should have been unbearable, in the perfect alignment of her silverware, adjusted and readjusted every few minutes, control when she had none, in the water glass that sat nearly full, barely touched, a throat too tight to swallow, in the eyes that stayed downcast, not from shyness but from something closer to shame, and in the hands that trembled ever so slightly when they moved, when they thought no one was watching. Elena recognized all of it because she had seen it before, in her own mirror 5 years ago, when her world had collapsed and she had learned what it meant to be erased. The men at the table were the architects of that drowning. The silver-haired one at the head, radiating cold authority. The younger one to his right, all predatory smiles and hollow eyes. The woman with the sharp bob and sharper tongue, treating the young woman like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. And the young woman herself, sitting in the middle of it all, perfectly still, perfectly silent, perfectly miserable. Elena felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. a protective instinct, a desire to step in, to say something, to do something. It was foolish, dangerous. She was a waitress. These were titans of industry. Her job was to be invisible, to serve, to collect her tips and go home. But watching this young woman, who could not have been more than 30, sitting with the stillness of someone who had learned that any movement might shatter her completely, Elena felt the invisible armor she had built around herself begin to crack. This girl reminded her of someone she used to be before the fall, before invisibility was forced rather than chosen, someone who had believed that intelligence and hard work and integrity mattered, someone who had not yet learned that powerful men could destroy you for no other reason than that your existence inconvenienced them. Elena moved toward table 7 to refill the wine glasses, and as she did, she heard the conversation shift. The silver-haired man was speaking, his voice carrying the casual arrogance of someone who had never been told no. The old guard in Tokyo simply does not grasp the realities of a 21st century market. Brandon Blackwell was laughing, the sound harsh and grating. They are still operating on honor and handshakes. Quaint, really. Marcus Blackwell grunted his agreement. Honor does not show up on a balance sheet. We will need to streamline these sentimental assets immediately. The art collection, the cultural grants. It is all dead weight. Elena watched the young woman's back go rigid, watched her knuckles turn white against the white tablecloth, watched her lips part as if to speak, and watched Victoria Chen cut her off before a single word could escape. Speaking of assets, Marcus, the clause regarding the Nakamura Foundation is still vaguely worded. We will need to ensure full discretionary control post-acquisition. The Nakamura Foundation. Elena's breath caught. She knew that name. Knew it the way a scholar knows the subject of her life's work. Knew it the way someone knows the thing that destroyed them. The liquidation value is approximately 200 million, Victoria continued, flipping through her documents with clinical efficiency. Respectable, but we can do better if we move quickly. Reinvest the capital into R&D, maximize shareholder value. The foundation itself is a liability. Sentimental clutter. Sentimental clutter. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. They were talking about Hiroshi Nakamura's life's work, his journals, his collection, his philosophy, the art that had redefined an entire generation's understanding of the intersection between technology and beauty, calling it sentimental clutter. And the young woman at the table, Sophie, her nameplate at the place setting read Sophie Nakamura Sterling. Nakamura. She was Hiroshi's granddaughter. And they were dismantling his legacy right in front of her, talking over her, through her, as if she had no right to speak about her own grandfather's life's work. Elena saw the young woman's face drain of color, saw her sway slightly, as if the curated air in the room had suddenly become too thin to breathe. Saw her hand, trembling now without any attempt to hide it, reach for the water glass. It happened in slow motion. Sophie's fingers, slick with the condensation from the glass, could not quite grip it properly. The heavy crystal goblet tilted, tipped. The edge met the porcelain plate with a sound that shattered the restaurant's carefully maintained silence. Crack! The sound was not loud, but in that tomb of a dining room, it might as well have been a gunshot. Every head turned. Every conversation stopped. The entire restaurant, all its wealth and power and carefully curated exclusivity, focused its attention on the young woman who had just committed the unforgivable sin of being clumsy. Water spread across the pristine white tablecloth like a bloodstain. Shards of crystal scattered, catching the candlelight and throwing tiny rainbows across the table. Each piece reflected Sophie's face back at her, fractured into 1,000 broken angles. For a frozen moment, no one moved. Then Brandon Blackwell laughed. It was a short, derisive sound, cruel in its casualness. A bit clumsy, are we not? He dabbed at a stray drop of water on his sleeve with his napkin, the gesture slow and deliberate. Do not worry, Miss Sterling. I am sure Daddy's company can afford the damages. The humiliation was instantaneous and total. Sophie stared at the mess in front of her, vision blurring. All her poise, all her training, all the carefully constructed walls she had built to survive this dinner, crumbled in the space of a heartbeat. Under her breath, in a voice so low it was barely more than an exhalation, she whispered a single desperate phrase. In Japanese. In the language of her mother, the language of her heart, the language that came to her when English felt like a prison. Mudada, watashi ni wa dekinai, hitori de wa murida. It is no use. I cannot do this. Alone, it is impossible. She was not speaking to anyone. The words were not meant to be heard. They were simply the involuntary release of despair, the sound of someone breaking. To the men at the table, it was just meaningless foreign noise. Further proof that she was out of her depth, losing her composure, even more dismissible than before. Marcus exchanged a glance with Victoria. Brandon smirked into his wine glass. The message was clear. This girl was not equipped for these negotiations. She was an embarrassment. But someone else heard. Elena Torres, who had been moving forward with a fresh napkin to clean up the spill, froze. For a fraction of a second, her carefully maintained professional mask slipped. Her eyes widened, her breath caught, because she understood every word. Their eyes met across the wreckage of the broken glass and the spreading water. And for the first time all evening, for the first time in 93 minutes of suffocating invisibility, Sophie Nakamura Sterling was truly seen. Not as a signature on a contract, not as a decorative element at a business dinner, not as an inconvenience or an embarrassment or a formality to be endured, as a human being in pain. Elena leaned in close, ostensibly to clear away the broken glass. But as she did, she spoke. Her voice was soft, barely more than a murmur, meant only for Sophie's ears, and the language that came from her lips was flawless Japanese, the accent pure Kyoto, refined and musical. Daijoubu desu ka, Oho-sama? Anata wa hitori ja arimasen. Watashi ga imasu. Are you all right, my lady? You are not alone. I am here. The world stopped. For Sophie, the effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. The Japanese words, spoken with such unexpected fluency and gentleness, bypassed every defense she had left. They went straight past the corporate language and the business posturing and the cultural performance, straight to the frightened part of her that had been drowning for 93 minutes and thought no one cared enough to notice. Oho-sama, my lady. It was an archaic term, almost courtly, the kind of respectful address that belonged to a different era. It should have sounded strange coming from a waitress in a modern Manhattan restaurant, but somehow in this moment, it was exactly right. It was validation. It was recognition. It was being seen not as a title or a signature, but as a person worthy of respect. Sophie's head snapped up. Tears that she had been fighting to contain now streamed freely down her face, and she did not care about the mascara that was probably running, the perfect makeup that was probably ruined, the professional image that was probably destroyed. None of it mattered. Someone had spoken to her. Not at her, not over her, not about her. To her. In the language of her heart. And that someone saw her pain and cared enough to respond. Her wide, shocked eyes locked onto Elena's face. The waitress's expression was serene, professional, perfect for the watching restaurant. But her eyes held an ocean of understanding, a depth of shared experience that was impossible to fake. The world, which had been a cacophony of condescension and dismissal and suffocating silence, narrowed to this single point of impossible connection, the invisible speaking to the voiceless. Across the table, Marcus Blackwell's fork clattered onto his plate. He stared at Elena, his brain visibly struggling to process what had just happened. The furniture had just spoken, in a language he did not understand, to the woman he had been ignoring all evening. Brandon's smug expression melted into confusion. His jaw actually dropped, hanging open in a way that would have been comical if the moment were not so charged. Victoria's pen hovered frozen above her documents, her legal mind trying to calculate this new variable and coming up with no precedent. The power in the room had shifted. They could feel it, even if they did not yet understand it. The careful hierarchy they had constructed, with themselves at the top and everyone else arranged below according to their usefulness, had just been disrupted by the one person they had not even bothered to notice existed, a waitress. And the woman they had dismissed as too weak, too young, too foreign to matter. And Sophie, for the first time in 93 minutes, took a full breath. Deep and shuddering and desperate, the kind of breath a drowning person takes when they finally break the surface of the water. Because someone saw her, someone heard her. And in the most expensive restaurant in New York, surrounded by men who had decided her voice did not matter, Sophie Nakamura Sterling realized something that would change everything. She was not alone. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge suddenly materialized over an impossible chasm. Japanese words. Perfect, fluent, impossibly kind. Spoken by a waitress to an heiress in the middle of the most expensive restaurant in Manhattan. And somehow, in that moment, nothing else in the world mattered. Sophie Nakamura Sterling felt something crack open inside her chest. Not breaking. Opening like a door that had been locked for so long she had forgotten what lay behind it. The Japanese language, her mother's language, the language that lived in the deepest parts of her heart where English could not reach, was being offered to her like oxygen to a drowning woman. Watashi ga imasu. I am here. 3 words. But they carried the weight of a lifeline. The tears that Sophie had been fighting to contain for 93 minutes now flowed freely down her face, and she found that she did not care. Did not care that her mascara was probably running black streaks down her carefully made-up cheeks. Did not care that the men at the table were staring at her with expressions ranging from confusion to contempt. Did not care that she was breaking every rule of professional conduct her father had ever tried to teach her. Someone had seen her. Someone had spoken to her, not at her or over her or around her, but directly to her, in the language of her heart. And that someone understood. Elena remained close, her hands moving with practiced efficiency to gather the larger shards of broken crystal with a napkin. To anyone watching, she was simply a waitress doing her job, cleaning up the mess with professional detachment. But her eyes never left Sophie's face, and in those eyes, Sophie saw something she had not seen in another human being in longer than she could remember. Recognition. Not of her name or her title or her family's money. Recognition of her pain, her isolation, her humanity. Sophie drew in a shaking breath and did something she had not planned, had not calculated, had not weighed for strategic value. She responded, in Japanese. Her voice was trembling, but it was hers, fully hers, in a way that English had never quite allowed it to be. Hai daijoubu desu? Arigatou gozaimasu. Yes, I am all right. Thank you. Then, because she needed to know, because this moment felt both impossible and essential, she added in a whisper, Anata wa dare desu ka? Who are you? Elena's hands paused for the briefest moment in their work. A smile crossed her face, so small and fleeting that someone not watching closely would have missed it entirely. When she spoke again, her voice carried a warmth that seemed to wrap around Sophie like a blanket. Tada no waitress desu. Demo anata no seishin wa tsuyoi. Karera ni wa makete nai. Just a waitress, but your spirit is strong. Do not let them break you. The conversation was happening in plain sight, in the middle of a crowded restaurant, at a table surrounded by some of the most powerful business people in New York. But it might as well have been taking place in another dimension. The men at the table could hear the sounds, could recognize that a language was being spoken, but they were utterly, completely locked out. For the first time all evening, they were the ones who did not understand. They were the outsiders. Brandon Blackwell was the first to lose his composure. His hand came down on the table. Not quite a slam, but close enough to rattle the silverware. His face had flushed an angry red, and his voice carried an edge of barely controlled frustration. What is going on here? What are you two talking about? His tone was that of a man who was used to being in control, used to understanding everything that happened in his presence, and who was deeply unsettled by being excluded. It was the voice of someone who confused his ability to dominate a room with actual power, and who was now discovering the limits of that confusion. Marcus Blackwell held up one hand, a gesture that silenced his son instantly. But unlike Brandon, Marcus's expression was not anger. It was something closer to fascination. Cold, calculating fascination, like a scientist observing an unexpected result in an experiment. He leaned back in his chair, his pale blue eyes moving from Sophie to Elena and back again. When he spoke, his voice was measured, controlled, but there was an undercurrent of something new in it, curiosity, and perhaps, though he would never have admitted it, a touch of respect. You speak Japanese. It was not quite a question, not quite an accusation. It was a statement that demanded explanation. Elena straightened slowly. a new waiter hovering nearby with fresh linens to reset Sophie's place setting. She gave him a brief nod of acknowledgement, and he moved in to do his work while she turned her full attention to Marcus Blackwell. "I do, sir." 2 words, simple, direct, offering nothing beyond the bare acknowledgement of fact. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. In his world, people explained themselves. They justified. They provided context and credentials and reasons why they should be taken seriously. This waitress was doing none of those things. She was simply standing there, calm and self-possessed, as if the fact of her speaking Japanese required no more elaboration than the fact that the sky was blue. "How?" Marcus pressed. "Where did you learn?" There was a pause. Elena's gaze flickered to Sophie for just a moment, something passing between them that Marcus could not read. Then she looked back at him, and when she spoke, her voice had that same quality of careful simplicity. "I studied, sir, a long time ago." The answer was somehow both truthful and completely inadequate. It offered the bare minimum of information, while revealing nothing of substance. It was the kind of response that might have come from someone trained in intelligence work, or someone who had learned through hard experience that offering too much information to powerful men was dangerous. Marcus studied her with the intensity of a man who had built an empire on his ability to read people, to find their pressure points, to understand what motivated them. But this woman, this waitress in her plain black uniform with her weary eyes and her perfect Japanese, was not giving him anything to work with. And that, paradoxically, made her more interesting. Victoria Chen had recovered from her initial shock and was now watching the exchange with the sharp focus of a lawyer looking for an angle. Her pen had resumed its position above her legal pad, ready to take notes on anything that might be relevant. But for now, she stayed silent, content to observe. It was Sophie who broke the stalemate, and when she did, her voice was different. The trembling uncertainty was still there at the edges, but underneath it was something new, something that had not been present for the entire 93 minutes of this dinner. Strength. She sat up straighter in her chair, her shoulders pulling back in a posture her mother would have recognized. Her hands, which had been trembling moments before, settled into stillness, and when she turned to face Marcus Blackwell, she looked him directly in the eyes, not with defiance exactly, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had just discovered that she was not as alone as she had believed. "Mr. Blackwell." The way she said his name made everyone at the table turn to look at her. It was not the hesitant, deferential tone she had used earlier when she had tried and failed to speak. This was the voice of someone who expected to be heard. "Perhaps your son is right about one thing?" She paused, letting the words settle. Marcus's eyebrows rose fractionally. Brandon's mouth opened as if to interject, but his father silenced him with a look. Sophie continued, her voice gaining confidence with each word. "Perhaps the old guard in Tokyo does operate on principles that you find outdated." Another pause. She could see them beginning to relax, beginning to think that she was agreeing with them, that she was finally acknowledging the superiority of their modern, pragmatic approach to business. Then she delivered the rest of it. "Principles like respect." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the silence that followed. Sophie let it hang there for a long moment before she continued, her eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "My grandfather, Hiroshi Nakamura, built his company on one fundamental belief. He believed that you cannot truly know a business partner until you understand their heart. And you cannot understand someone's heart if you dismiss their language, if you ignore their culture, if you do not even bother to look at them when they are sitting right in front of you." Her voice was steady now, each word carefully chosen and precisely delivered. She was no longer the frightened, silent girl who had sat through 93 minutes of being ignored. She was Hiroshi Nakamura's granddaughter, and she was speaking with his voice, his wisdom, his quiet but unshakable certainty. He believed that true strength was not measured by how loudly you could speak or how forcefully you could impose your will. True strength, he said, came from listening, from understanding, from having the humility to recognize that there might be value in perspectives different from your own. She turned her gaze to each of them in turn. Brandon, who was staring at her with an expression somewhere between anger and confusion. Victoria, whose sharp legal mind was clearly recalculating the dynamics of this negotiation. And finally back to Marcus, who was watching her with an intensity that suggested he was truly seeing her for the first time. None of you have listened to a single word I have tried to say tonight, not one. Because you decided before you even arrived at this restaurant that my voice did not matter, that I was simply a formality, a signature that you needed to complete your transaction. You did not see me as a partner, you saw me as an obstacle to be managed. The indictment was delivered without anger, without accusation. Just simple, devastating truth. And perhaps that was what made it so powerful. She was not attacking them. She was simply holding up a mirror and forcing them to look at what they had become. Brandon's face had gone from red to a deeper, angrier shade of crimson. His hands were clenched on the table, and Sophie could see him struggling to contain whatever he wanted to say. But he held his tongue, perhaps sensing that anything he said now would only make things worse. Victoria's expression had settled into a thin, bloodless line. Her legal training had taught her to maintain composure in any situation. But Sophie could see the tension in her jaw, the way her fingers had tightened on her pen. Marcus, however, was different. His face showed no anger, no defensiveness. Instead, there was something that looked almost like surprise, as if he had just realized that the decorative element they had placed at the table was actually a person. And not just a person, but someone with intelligence and conviction and the courage to speak truth to power. The ghost, it seemed, had found her voice, and she was more formidable than any of them had imagined. Into this charged silence, Marcus Blackwell did something unexpected. He turned his attention away from Sophie and back to Elena, who had finished helping the other waiter reset Sophie's place setting, and now stood a respectful distance away, waiting to see if she was needed. "Waitress." His voice carried through the dining room, resonating with the kind of authority that made people stop and turn. Several other tables glanced over, curious about what was happening at table 7. "Come here." Elena walked back to the table with the same economical grace she had displayed all evening. Her face showed nothing. No fear, no excitement, no reaction at all. Just professional neutrality. But Sophie, watching her carefully, thought she saw something flicker in the woman's eyes. A calculation, a decision being made. Marcus gestured vaguely to the empty space near Sophie's chair. "Miss Nakamura Sterling seems to suggest that we have had a failure in communication tonight. A cultural misunderstanding, perhaps." There was a light edge of sarcasm in his tone, but it was not as cutting as it might have been. He was a man adjusting his tactics, trying a different approach. "You seem to understand her world in a way that we do not. From now on, you will remain here at this table. You will facilitate our discussion, translate if necessary. Help us avoid any further misunderstandings." It was a preposterous command, delivered as casually as one might ask for more water. A waitress, pulled from her duties to act as a cultural interpreter in a multi-billion-dollar business negotiation. It was also, Sophie realized, a power play. Marcus was attempting to reassert control over a situation that had slipped away from him. He was taking Elena's unexpected skill and trying to turn it into his own tool, to reduce her back to a functionary, albeit a more interesting one than before. The manager of Ethelard, a perpetually anxious man named Julian, materialized at the edge of the table as if summoned by the sheer force of the disruption to his carefully ordered restaurant. His face was pale, his hands already moving in small placating gestures. "Mr. Blackwell, I do apologize, but Elena has other tables assigned to her this evening. Perhaps I could arrange for someone else to assist you, or we could—" "I will cover her entire night's wages and tips." Marcus cut him off without even looking at him, his eyes still fixed on Elena. "Double them. She works for me now for the remainder of this dinner. Do you have a problem with that?" The last question was directed at Julian, but the look Marcus gave him made it clear that there was only one acceptable answer. "No, sir. Of course not, sir." Julian practically bowed as he backed away, shooting Elena a look that was equal parts apology and envy. The tips at table 7 were going to be astronomical tonight, even by Ethelard's standards. Marcus turned his attention back to Elena. "And you, do you have a problem with that?" It was meant to be a rhetorical question, a formality. Of course she did not have a problem with it. She was a waitress being offered double pay to stand at a table for an hour. What could she possibly object to? But Elena did not answer immediately. Instead, For the first time since this entire sequence had begun, something shifted in her carefully maintained professional demeanor. A flicker of something crossed her face, not fear or gratitude or deference, something closer to amusement, or perhaps defiance, or both. Her eyes moved from Marcus to Sophie, and Sophie, understanding the unspoken question, gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture so subtle that anyone not watching closely would have missed it entirely. But in that tiny movement, an alliance was formed. A choice was made. Two women, separated by class and circumstance and the arbitrary hierarchies of the world, choosing each other, against a room full of powerful men who had spent the entire evening trying to make them feel small. Elena turned back to Marcus, and when she spoke, her voice was perfectly level, perfectly professional. But there was something underneath it now, a bedrock of dignity that had not been there before, or perhaps had simply been hidden. "No, sir, I do not have a problem with that." A pause, and then she added, "Where shall we begin?" The question was simple, practical, but the way she asked it shifted something fundamental in the room. She was not asking for instructions. She was asking what they wanted to accomplish, as if she were a consultant brought in to solve a problem, not a servant commandeered to do her master's bidding. Marcus studied her for a long moment, and Sophie could almost see the gears turning behind those cold blue eyes. He was reassessing, recalculating, trying to figure out exactly what kind of person he was dealing with. Julian had scurried away, no doubt to redistribute Elena's tables among the other servers, and to spread the gossip about what was happening at table 7. A few other waiters cast curious glances in their direction, but the professional staff of Ethelard knew better than to stare openly at the customers, no matter how unusual the situation. Elena remained standing, positioned a few feet behind and to the side of Sophie's chair. She did not sit. That would have been too presumptuous, too much of a violation of the unspoken rules. But her stance was that of someone waiting attentively, ready to contribute, not someone cowering in subservience. Marcus leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in front of him in a gesture Sophie recognized as his thinking pose. When he spoke, his voice had lost some of its earlier edge. He was treating this now as a puzzle to be solved, rather than a disruption to be managed. "All right, let us talk about the Nakamura Art Foundation." He directed his words at Sophie, but his eyes flickered to Elena as if gauging her reaction. "Our analysts have projected the liquidation value at approximately $200 million, a respectable sum. However, the foundation itself is, from a business perspective, a dead asset. It generates no revenue. It serves no strategic purpose in the current market. Our plan is to divest the collection and reinvest the capital into research and development, where it can actually produce returns." He paused, then added with a gesture toward Elena, "Explain that to her. Make sure she understands the business rationale." It was a deliberate attempt to put Sophie back in the position of someone who needed things explained to her, who required translation not of language, but of complex concepts that were beyond her grasp. A petty reassertion of dominance. Elena took one step forward, her movement fluid and deliberate. When she spoke, her voice was calm and measured, but there was an undercurrent of something that made everyone at the table pay attention. "Mr. Blackwell, Miss Nakamura Sterling understands English perfectly well. She graduated summa cum laude from Harvard with a degree in international business. The issue here is not one of language or comprehension. The issue is one of context." The correction was delivered so smoothly, so professionally, that it took Marcus a moment to realize he had just been called out. His eyebrows rose fractionally. Victoria Chen scoffed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "Context? We are discussing a simple balance sheet calculation. The asset is underperforming. The solution is straightforward. Where exactly is the context we are missing?" Elena turned her gaze to Victoria, and for a moment, the waitress's mask slipped entirely. What showed through was the mind of someone who had spent years studying, analyzing, understanding things that these business people had never even considered. "With respect, ma'am, you are referring to a collection that includes 3 scrolls from the Kamakura period, 13th century. These scrolls are believed to be the only surviving works of the monk Kenshin, who pioneered a style of calligraphic meditation that influenced Japanese spiritual art for 3 centuries. You are also referring to a collection of Edo period ceramics that fundamentally redefined the art of kintsugi, the practice of repairing broken pottery with gold. She paused, letting the specificity of her knowledge sink in. You call it a dead asset. The Japanese Ministry of Culture calls it a national treasure. Several of the pieces in the Nakamura collection cannot legally be sold outside of Japan. Others cannot be sold at all without government approval, which, I assure you, would not be granted. Your $200 million liquidation value is, at best, wildly optimistic. At worst, it is based on fundamentally flawed assumptions about what can actually be liquidated. The silence that followed was absolute. Brandon was staring at Elena as if she had just sprouted a second head. Victoria's pen had stopped moving entirely, hovering above her legal pad. Marcus's expression had shifted from curiosity to something approaching shock. A waitress, citing 13th century Japanese art history, discussing government export restrictions, dismantling their financial projections with the casual expertise of someone who actually knew what they were talking about. Brandon found his voice first, and it came out as an incredulous, almost mocking laugh. Wait, you are telling me that you, a waitress at this restaurant, are an expert on Japanese art history? Elena turned to look at him, and her expression was utterly neutral. I did not say I was an expert, Mr. Blackwell. I said I studied it a long time ago. Studied it where? Victoria demanded, her lawyer's instincts kicking in. How exactly does a waitress come to know about Kamakura period scrolls and export restrictions? For the first time, Elena hesitated. It was brief, barely a heartbeat's worth of pause, but Sophie saw it, saw the flicker of old pain that crossed Elena's face before she locked it down behind her professional mask. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the secularization of Buddhist art during the Ashikaga shogunate, Elena said quietly. My focus was on the very school of artists that Hiroshi Nakamura, Miss Nakamura Sterling's grandfather, spent his life championing and preserving. The words dropped into the conversation like stones into water, sending out ripples of shocked disbelief. A waitress, a doctoral dissertation. The pieces did not fit, could not fit, not in the ordered, hierarchical world that these people inhabited. You have a doctorate? Victoria's voice was sharp with skepticism. A PhD? And you are serving appetizers at Ethelard? Brandon let out a harsh, derisive laugh. You are a doctor of art history and you are bringing me sea bass? How does that even happen? His tone was cruel, mocking the very idea that someone with credentials could fall so far. There was no curiosity in his question, no empathy for whatever circumstances might have led to such a dramatic reversal of fortune. Just contempt for failure, for weakness, for not being successful in the ways that he recognized as valid. Elena's face remained carefully neutral, but Sophie saw her hands tighten briefly before relaxing again. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but there was a brittleness underneath it. The brittleness of someone who had told this story before, or thought about telling it, and knew how it sounded to people who had never experienced that kind of fall. Life is full of unexpected turns, Mr. Blackwell. The academic world is not always a meritocracy. It was not really an answer. It was a deflection, a way of acknowledging the question without actually addressing it. But Marcus, unlike his son, was paying attention not just to what was being said, but to what was not being said. He leaned forward slightly, his cold blue eyes fixed on Elena with renewed interest. Forgive my bluntness, Dr. Torres. He used the title deliberately, and Sophie noticed the slight widening of Elena's eyes at hearing it. But those two career paths do not typically intersect. How does one go from a PhD at what I assume was a prestigious university to waiting tables at a restaurant, however exclusive? It was the same question Brandon had asked, but asked differently. There was no mockery in Marcus's voice, just genuine, calculating curiosity. He was a man who understood that people's stories mattered, that understanding what motivated someone, what had broken them, what they wanted, was the key to either using them or defeating them. Elena looked at Sophie again. It was becoming a pattern, that glance, that unspoken question. And Sophie, understanding what was being asked, gave another small nod. Permission, encouragement, solidarity. Elena took a breath, and when she began to speak, her voice was quiet but clear. I was on the tenure track at Columbia University. I had a grant to curate a major exhibition on post-war Japanese industrial art. My research was unconventional. It challenged certain established narratives that had been set by some very influential people in the field, people who did not appreciate having their life's work questioned by a junior academic. She paused, and Sophie could see her choosing her words carefully. There was a hearing, an accusation of academic fraud. I was accused of falsifying my sources, of fabricating evidence to support my theories. The hearing cleared me officially, but the damage was done. My funding was pulled, the exhibition was canceled, my name was effectively blacklisted in academic circles. No university would touch me after that. She delivered the story with a calm, factual precision that made it somehow more devastating. There was no self-pity in her voice, no plea for sympathy. Just the simple recitation of how a career, a life's work, a dream could be destroyed by powerful people who felt threatened. So I took a job where I could be invisible, where I could support myself while I waited for circumstances to change. That was 5 years ago. Circumstances have not changed. The last sentence was delivered with a finality that suggested she did not expect them ever to change, that this was simply her life now, that the woman who had once been Dr. Elena Torres, promising scholar and rising star in her field, had been permanently replaced by Elena the waitress, invisible and forgettable. But Sophie, watching the faces around the table, realized that invisibility was no longer possible, not anymore. Elena had revealed too much, shown too much of the person underneath the uniform. And now everyone at this table was being forced to confront the fact that they had been dismissing someone who knew more about the very thing they were negotiating than they did. Marcus was silent for a long time, long enough that the ambient noise of the restaurant, the murmur of other conversations, and the subtle clink of silverware seemed to rush back in to fill the void. He was staring at Elena, but Sophie could tell he was really looking at something else, some calculation, some reassessment of everything he thought he understood about this evening. Finally, he spoke. His voice was thoughtful, the tone of a man working through a problem in real time. The Nakamura Foundation, the collection. You are saying our valuation is wrong. It was not quite a question, more of a statement that invited correction or confirmation. I am saying, Elena replied carefully, that your valuation is based on incomplete information, possibly deliberately incomplete. Victoria's head snapped up at that. Deliberately? Are you suggesting our consultants provided us with fraudulent analysis? Elena did not flinch from the sharp accusation in Victoria's voice. I am suggesting that the art world, like any world, has its politics and its grudges, and that expert opinions can be shaped by factors that have nothing to do with objective analysis. It was a careful answer, calibrated to suggest wrongdoing without making a direct accusation. But it was enough to plant a seed of doubt. Sophie could see it in the way Victoria's eyes narrowed, in the way her pen resumed its note-taking with renewed intensity. Marcus, however, was focused on something else. You said your research focused on the very artist that Hiroshi Nakamura championed, so you know his work, his philosophy. Yes. Elena's voice was soft now, almost reverent. I spent 3 years studying his journals, his collection, his approach to integrating traditional Japanese aesthetics with modern technology. His work was the foundation of my dissertation. It was going to be the foundation of my career. There was a world of loss in those words. A career that never was. A future that had been stolen. And Sophie, hearing it, felt a surge of something that was part anger, part solidarity, part determination. These men, these powerful, dismissive men, had spent the entire evening treating both of them as if they did not matter, as if their voices, their knowledge, their very existence was just an inconvenience to be managed. But Sophie and Elena, in their different ways, had both been shaped by Hiroshi Nakamura's legacy. They both understood something that Marcus and Brandon and Victoria never could, that there were things more valuable than money, that heritage and beauty and meaning mattered, that a person's worth could not be measured on a balance sheet. Sophie reached up to touch the crane and moon pin on her lapel. The gesture was unconscious, but it caught Elena's attention. Their eyes met, and Sophie saw a flash of something in Elena's face. Recognition, wonder, understanding. Elena took a half step closer, her professional reserve cracking just slightly. When she spoke, her voice carried a note of awe that she could not quite suppress. Is that... She stopped, swallowed, tried again. Forgive me, but is that a Nakamura piece? and original. Sophie's fingers traced the outline of the crane in flight. It is the first piece my grandfather ever made. He created it for my grandmother. He said it represented a choice. She switched to Japanese without thinking about it, the language flowing naturally for the first time all evening. Tsuru wa tsuki ni tobu koto ga dekiru, tsumetakute sabishii yabo no basho, mata wa ashi ni todomaru koto mo dekiru, atatakakute community no basho. The crane can fly to the moon, a place of cold, lonely ambition. Or it can stay in the reeds, a place of warmth and community. Elena's eyes were fixed on the pin, and Sophie could see the rapid calculations happening behind them. The recognition of the style, the significance, the rarity. When Elena responded, her Japanese was equally fluent, equally natural. Tsuzuru tutsuki, kare no zenteki na oshie desu ne, baransu, chawa, yabo to ningensei no aida no michi. The crane and the moon. His entire teaching, is it not? Balance, harmony, the path between ambition and humanity. And then, in a voice that shook slightly with emotion, Shashin de shika mita koto ga arimasen. Watashi wa sore ni tsuite no sho o kakimashita. Gakui ronbun de. I have only seen it in photographs. I wrote a chapter about it. In my doctoral dissertation, the connection that formed in that moment was almost visible, a current of understanding that ran between the two women and excluded everyone else at the table. They were speaking not just a different language, but about a different world, a world of art and philosophy and meaning that the men around them could not access. Brandon's frustration boiled over. What? What are you talking about? What chapter? What dissertation? But neither Sophie nor Elena looked at him. They were too busy looking at each other, seeing in each other something that had been missing from this entire evening. An ally, a kindred spirit, someone who understood. Marcus Blackwell watched this exchange with an expression that was difficult to read. For a man who had built his entire empire on control, on understanding and dominating every situation he entered, this dinner had become something entirely outside his experience. The woman he had ignored was speaking with authority about her family's legacy. The waitress he had dismissed was revealing depths of knowledge and expertise that exceeded anyone at his own table. And he, Marcus Blackwell, titan of industry, was the one who did not understand what was happening. The power in the room had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted, and for the first time in a very long time, Marcus Blackwell did not know what to do about it. The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged with the weight of revelations that were still unfolding, connections that were still being made. Sophie and Elena stood on one side of an invisible divide, speaking a language that was both literal and metaphorical, while Marcus, Brandon, and Victoria found themselves on the other side, suddenly and uncomfortably aware that they were the ones who did not understand. Marcus Blackwell had not achieved what he had achieved by being slow to adapt. He was a predator, yes, but a smart one. And smart predators knew when the terrain had shifted beneath them. The question was not whether to adapt. The question was how, and how quickly. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming a slow rhythm on the tablecloth. It was a tell, one that his competitors had learned to watch for over the years. Marcus Blackwell only drummed his fingers when he was genuinely uncertain about his next move, when he was calculating odds that refused to come out cleanly in his favor. Dr. Torres, he said, and the use of the title was deliberate, a small concession that cost him nothing but might buy him information. You said your research was on Hiroshi Nakamura's work. You wrote about this pin that Miss Nakamura Sterling is wearing. I assume that means you studied his entire collection, his entire philosophy. It was not quite a question. It was an invitation for Elena to continue talking, to reveal more of what she knew, because Marcus was beginning to understand, with the slow, uncomfortable certainty of a man who had made a terrible miscalculation, that this woman knew things that his own consultants had not told him. Elena met his gaze without flinching. I did, yes. I spent 3 years immersed in his journals, his artistic output, his business philosophy. Hiroshi Nakamura was not just an artist or just a businessman. He was both, seamlessly. He saw no division between aesthetic beauty and functional design. between cultural preservation and technological innovation. That integration was the foundation of his success. She paused, and Sophie could see her choosing her words carefully. It was also what made him a threat to certain established academics who preferred their borrower categories neat and separate. Art over here, business over there, never the two shall meet. Victoria Chen's pen was moving rapidly now, taking notes with the focused intensity of a lawyer who sensed that the ground was shifting and wanted a record of exactly how and when. You keep mentioning established academics. You said someone accused you of fraud. Who was it? The question was sharp, direct, prosecutorial. Victoria had clearly decided that the best way to regain control of this situation was to treat it like a deposition, to extract facts and build a case. Elena's face remained carefully neutral, but Sophie saw something flicker in her eyes. Old pain, yes, but also old anger. The kind of anger that had been banked for years, waiting for the right moment to burn. The head of the East Asian Arts Department at Columbia, a man named Professor Gerald Whitmore. The name dropped into the conversation like a depth charge, invisible at first, but with implications that would ripple outward in all directions. Sophie saw Victoria's pen stop moving, saw Marcus's fingers stop their drumming, saw Brandon look up from his phone, where he had been half-checking his messages, suddenly paying full attention. Victoria recovered first, her lawyer's training kicking in to keep her voice level even as her mind raced through implications. Gerald Whitmore, I know that name. You should, Elena said quietly. He is considered one of the foremost experts on Japanese art in the Western world. He has been the head of his department for 20 years. He sits on the board of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He has published 6 books and dozens of peer-reviewed articles. His reputation is essentially unassailable. The way she said it made clear that she did not consider that reputation deserved, but that it was nonetheless a fact that had to be acknowledged. Marcus was watching Elena with the intensity of a man who could sense that he was about to learn something important, but could not yet see what it was. And he accused you of fraud because your research contradicted his work. It was a statement, not a question. Marcus understood academic politics well enough to see the shape of what had happened. Not just contradicted, Elena corrected. Proved wrong. His seminal work on post-war Japanese industrial aesthetics was based on his translation and interpretation of Hiroshi Nakamura's journals. Journals that were written in Japanese, obviously, but that also contained significant amounts of technical jargon, artistic terminology, and cultural references that required not just fluency but deep contextual understanding to translate accurately. She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried the quiet certainty of someone stating facts that she had verified beyond any possible doubt. Professor Whitmore's Japanese is adequate for basic communication, but insufficient for the kind of nuanced translation that serious scholarship requires. He made errors, not small ones, fundamental misunderstandings of what Nakamura was actually saying about the relationship between traditional craft and modern manufacturing, between aesthetic philosophy and market strategy. Sophie found herself leaning forward, drawn into the story despite knowing, on some level, where it must be heading. This was the kind of academic drama that most people never heard about. The quiet destruction of careers that happened behind closed doors in conference rooms and committee hearings. I brought evidence, Elena continued. Original documents, secondary sources, testimony from Japanese scholars who confirmed my translations. I thought truth mattered. I thought that if I could prove my case with sufficient rigor, the academic community would have no choice but to acknowledge it. Her voice carried a bitter edge now, the tone of someone who had learned a hard lesson about how the world actually worked versus how it was supposed to work. I was wrong. Professor Whitmore had spent 20 years building his reputation on that work. He had students who had built their careers on his framework. He had institutional power and personal relationships and all the soft influence that comes from being the respected elder statesman of a field. And I was a junior academic, a woman, someone who could be dismissed as ambitious and aggressive and probably sleeping with someone to get ahead. Brandon made a small, uncomfortable sound in his throat. Even he, apparently, could recognize the ugliness of what Elena was describing. The hearing was a formality, Elena said. They exonerated me officially because the evidence was too strong to completely ignore. But they also made it clear that I was no longer welcome. My funding was pulled due to budgetary constraints. My exhibition was canceled due to scheduling conflicts. And somehow, every university I applied to after that had already filled their positions by the time my application was reviewed. She delivered the story without self-pity, just a calm recitation of facts. But Sophie could hear the weight of those 5 years in her voice. 5 years of being invisible, of serving meals to people who looked through her, of waiting for a vindication that never came. So I took a job here, Elena finished, where nobody asks about my credentials or my past, where I could be invisible and safe and forgotten. The word forgotten hung in the air like an accusation, because that was what the academic world had tried to do to her. Forget that she existed. Erase her work and her name and her inconvenient truths. Sophie felt something hot and sharp burning in her chest. Anger, yes, but also recognition. She knew what it felt like to be erased, to have your voice dismissed, to be treated as if your existence was an inconvenience that powerful people had to tolerate. And now, sitting at this table, she was beginning to understand that she and Elena had more in common than just being invisible. They had both been threatened by the same kind of institutional power that protected itself by destroying anyone who challenged it. Marcus cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention back to him. This is a fascinating story, Dr. Torres, and I appreciate you sharing it. But I am not entirely clear on why it is relevant to our current discussion about the Nakamura Foundation. Victoria was nodding, clearly thinking along the same lines. Yes, the foundation's valuation is based on expert analysis from multiple consultants. Whatever personal history you might have with one academic does not change the fundamental business reality. Sophie watched Elena's face carefully, saw the moment when something shifted, when the careful neutrality gave way to something sharper, when the waitress who had learned to be invisible decided that invisibility was no longer serving her. It is relevant, Elena said, her voice still quiet but carrying an edge that had not been there before. Because Professor Gerald Whitmore is your consultant. The words fell like a hammer blow, simple, declarative, devastating. Victoria's face went pale. Her pen actually fell from her fingers, clattering onto her plate with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden stillness. She stared at Elena, then at Marcus, her professional composure finally, completely cracking. "Marcus," she said, and her voice was tight with the realization of what this meant. "Gerald Whitmore is the expert who prepared our valuation report on the Nakamura Foundation. He is the one who told us it was worth $200 million in liquidation. He is the one who recommended immediate divestiture. He is the one who called it non-essential cultural ephemera." Marcus's face had gone from its usual granite mask to something approaching shock. Real, genuine shock, the kind that came from realizing that you had walked into a trap that you should have seen coming. Sophie felt the pieces clicking into place in her own mind with sickening clarity. This was not just about business. This was personal. Professor Whitmore, unable to destroy Elena's research through academic channels, unable to erase the threat she posed to his reputation, had found another way. If the Nakamura collection did not exist, if it was broken up and sold off and scattered to private collectors who would never make it available for scholarly study, then Elena's work would become meaningless. She would be an expert on something that no longer existed in any accessible form. Her dissertation, her research, her entire academic identity would be rendered irrelevant. And he would have won, not through better scholarship or superior argument, but through the simple expedient of destroying the evidence. Elena's voice was soft when she spoke, but it carried the weight of 5 years of waiting, 5 years of being invisible, 5 years of watching someone get away with destroying her life. He could not destroy my research directly, so he decided to destroy the subject of it. If Hiroshi Nakamura's legacy does not exist in any meaningful form, if the collection is liquidated and the foundation is dissolved, then my work becomes a footnote about something that used to matter but no longer does. She looked directly at Marcus. And he is using you to do it, using your firm, your money, your reputation as the weapon to accomplish what he could not do through academic channels. You are not making a business decision, Mr. Blackwell. You are being manipulated into executing someone's personal vendetta. The silence that followed was absolute. Sophie could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the distant sounds of other conversations in the restaurant, could hear the soft rustle of fabric as people shifted in their seats. But at their table, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Brandon found his voice first, and it came out strangled with disbelief and anger. Wait, you are telling me that our entire financial strategy for this merger is based on some dusty professor's personal grudge? That the valuation we have been working from is deliberately fraudulent? I am saying, Elena replied carefully, that Professor Whitmore has a conflict of interest that he did not disclose, and that his valuation of the foundation's worth is likely influenced by factors that have nothing to do with objective market analysis. Victoria was shuffling through her documents now, pulling out the thick report that had been the foundation of their negotiation strategy. The valuation was co-signed by two other experts, Dr. Thomas Chen from Yale and Dr. Patricia Morrison from Berkeley, both highly credentialed, both with impeccable reputations. Elena's expression did not change, but Sophie saw her hands tighten slightly. Dr. Chen was Professor Whitmore's doctoral student. He got his position at Yale based on Whitmore's recommendation. Dr. Morrison has co-authored 3 papers with Whitmore over the past decade. They are not independent experts. They are his protégés and collaborators, people whose careers are tied to his reputation. She let that sink in for a moment before continuing. If Whitmore's foundational work is shown to be based on faulty translations, their work, which builds on his framework, becomes questionable as well. They have every incentive to support his position and every reason to discredit anyone who threatens it. Marcus Blackwell leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable, but his eyes sharp with the kind of cold fury that came from realizing you had been played. He had built an empire on information, on understanding all the angles, on never being the one caught by surprise. And now he was sitting at a table in the most expensive restaurant in Manhattan, being told that his billion-dollar deal was compromised because he had trusted the wrong expert. "How could we have known?" he asked, and it was not quite a question and not quite a defense. Whitmore came with impeccable credentials. His reputation is sterling. There was no reason to question his analysis. Elena met his gaze without flinching. There was every reason to question it if you had done proper due diligence. Not just on his credentials, which are indeed impressive, but on his potential conflicts of interest, on whether he had any personal connection to the subject he was evaluating, on whether his conclusions aligned with what other experts in the field, particularly Japanese experts, would say about the collection's value. She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried a note of something that might have been contempt or might have been pity. But you did not do that due diligence. You saw a famous name, you saw the institutional affiliations, and you assumed that was sufficient. You took the path of least resistance, which in this case meant accepting the word of a Western academic who told you what you wanted to hear about how a Japanese cultural institution was worthless. It was a brutal assessment, delivered without anger, but with devastating accuracy. Marcus had made a mistake, and it was exactly the kind of mistake that came from cultural arrogance, from assuming that Western expertise was sufficient to evaluate Eastern heritage, from not bothering to dig deeper because the surface answer was convenient. Sophie felt a surge of something that was half vindication and half rage. This was what she had been trying to tell them all evening, that they did not understand what they were buying, what they were destroying, what they were so casually dismissing as sentimental clutter. And now it turned out that even their expert analysis, the supposedly objective numbers that made their position unassailable, was built on a foundation of lies and personal grudges. "What is the foundation actually worth?" Marcus asked, and his voice was clipped, controlled, the tone of a man forcing himself to stay calm while his entire negotiating position collapsed beneath him. Elena glanced at Sophie, a silent question in her eyes. Sophie gave a small nod. Permission. Encouragement. This was Elena's expertise, her moment to reclaim the authority that had been stolen from her 5 years ago. "The collection itself," Elena began, her voice taking on the assured tone of someone speaking from deep knowledge, "contains pieces that cannot be assigned a market value in any conventional sense. The Kamakura scrolls I mentioned earlier are considered national treasures by Japan. They cannot be legally exported without explicit government permission, which would not be granted under any circumstances. They cannot be sold to private collectors. The only potential buyers would be Japanese museums or cultural institutions, and they would not pay market rates because they know the government would eventually pressure any private owner to donate or sell them at a significant discount. She was warming to her subject now, the academic in her emerging after 5 years of suppression. The Edo period ceramics are similarly restricted. Some can technically be sold, but doing so would create an international incident. The Japanese Cultural Ministry has been trying to repatriate significant examples of kintsugi work for decades. Selling them would be seen as cultural vandalism, and any company associated with that sale would find itself effectively blacklisted from Japanese markets. Brandon was staring at her with an expression that combined grudging respect with growing horror. So Whitmore's 200 million valuation is wildly optimistic at best, deliberately misleading at worst, Elena finished. In reality, the liquidation value of the collection is probably closer to 50 million, and that is if you are willing to accept the reputational damage and the loss of goodwill in the Japanese market, which, for a company like Nakamura Corporation, that derives a significant portion of its brand value from its Japanese heritage, would be catastrophic. She turned to look at Marcus directly. But that is only if you think of the foundation purely in terms of liquidation value, which is itself a fundamental misunderstanding of what the foundation actually does and what it is worth to the company. Victoria had regained some of her composure, her lawyer's instincts pushing through the shock. Explain that. Elena took a breath, and Sophie could see her organizing her thoughts, falling into the rhythm of academic argument that had once been her entire world. The Nakamura Foundation is not just a collection of old art sitting in a warehouse somewhere. It is an active, functioning institution that generates cultural capital for the Nakamura Corporation. It sponsors the most prestigious Young Artist Award in Japan. It funds university programs in design and aesthetics. It maintains workshops where traditional craftspeople can practice their trade. It serves as a research resource for scholars worldwide. She paused to let that sink in before continuing. All of that generates goodwill, brand loyalty, a reputation for cultural stewardship that translates directly into consumer trust. When someone in Japan buys a Nakamura product, they are not just buying technology. They are buying a piece of a company that respects and preserves their cultural heritage. That has value, enormous value, but it is not the kind of value that shows up on a quarterly balance sheet. Marcus was listening with the focused intensity of a man trying to salvage what he could from a deteriorating situation. Cultural capital. Exactly, Elena confirmed. If you liquidate the foundation, you might get 50 million in cash, minus the cost of the sale and the legal challenges and the reputational damage. But you lose something worth far more than that in the long term. You lose the brand differentiation that makes Nakamura Corporation unique in a crowded technology market. You lose the customer loyalty that has sustained the company through multiple business cycles. You lose the philosophical foundation that guides your product development and your corporate strategy. She looked at each of them in turn, making sure they understood. You would not just be buying a company. You would be buying a hollowed-out shell with a tarnished name and no soul. Your R&D would develop new products, certainly. But the customers who have been loyal to Nakamura because of what it stands for, because of its connection to Japanese culture and craftsmanship, those customers would leave. They would see you as vandals who destroyed something beautiful for short-term profit. And they would be right. The assessment was devastating in its clarity. Every word was a precision strike against the foundation of Sterling Whitmore's entire strategy. Elena was not just defending the Nakamura Foundation. She was systematically dismantling the logic that had brought them to this table, exposing it as based on ignorance, arrogance, and deliberate deception. Sophie felt something shifting inside her. For the entire evening, she had been on the defensive, trying to hold her ground against people who seemed so certain, so powerful, so sure of their position. But now, with Elena standing beside her, armed with expertise and righteous anger, and 5 years of pent-up frustration, the dynamic had changed completely. They were not defending anymore. They were prosecuting. And the men who had spent all evening dismissing them were the ones scrambling to respond. Marcus Blackwell sat in silence for a long moment, his face an unreadable mask. But Sophie could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. He was a businessman, first and foremost. And what Elena had just laid out was a business argument that he could not ignore. Not because it appealed to sentiment or culture or any of the soft factors he had spent his career discounting, but because it appealed to the one thing he did understand: risk. The risk of proceeding with a deal based on compromised information. The risk of destroying value in pursuit of short-term gains. The risk of reputational damage that could haunt Sterling Whitmore for years. These were risks that Marcus could calculate, could weigh, could factor into his decision-making. And they were risks that Sophie could see were making him very, very nervous. "This changes things," he said finally, his voice flat and controlled. He looked at Victoria. "We need to halt the current negotiation timeline. I want an independent valuation of the foundation, conducted by experts with no connection to Whitmore or his circle. I want a full review of every document he provided to us. And I want a meeting with our legal team to discuss potential liability for proceeding with a deal based on compromised analysis." Victoria was already making notes, her pen flying across her legal pad. "I will start making calls first thing tomorrow morning. We should also consider whether we have grounds for a complaint against Whitmore for failure to disclose conflicts of interest." Brandon, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. His voice had lost its earlier smugness, replaced by something that sounded almost like genuine concern. "Dad, if this gets out, if it becomes public that we almost made a billion-dollar decision based on some professor's personal vendetta, we will look like idiots. The board will have our heads." "Then it does not get out," Marcus said sharply. "This stays in this room until we figure out what actually happened and what our exposure is." He turned his attention back to Elena, and for the first time all evening, there was something in his eyes that looked almost like respect. "You have given us a great deal to think about, Dr. Torres. I am beginning to understand why Professor Whitmore saw you as such a threat." It was an acknowledgement, backhanded perhaps, but real. Elena had done what she had set out to do 5 years ago. She had challenged established authority with better research and more rigorous analysis. She had been right, and she had the expertise to prove it. And now, finally, someone with power was being forced to listen. But Sophie, watching Elena's face, saw that the vindication was bittersweet. 5 years too late. 5 years of being invisible, of being dismissed, of watching the man who had destroyed her career continue to thrive and prosper and use his influence to cause more damage. Justice delayed was not quite justice at all. Sophie drew in a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. For 93 minutes, she had been invisible, powerless, a ghost at her own negotiation. But now, the ghost had found not just her voice, but her power. She was no longer the defendant in this negotiation. She was the judge. And she had a verdict to deliver. She stood up slowly, deliberately, placing her napkin on the table beside her untouched Dover sole. The gesture was simple, but in the context of this dinner, it was revolutionary. She was ending the meeting. Not them, her. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, and her voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made everyone at the table stop and pay attention. "I believe we have been operating under a false premise all evening." She paused, making sure she had their full attention before continuing. This dinner was supposed to be a formality. A final meeting before signatures were exchanged and the deal was finalized. "You came here expecting me to be a decorative element, a rubber stamp, a young woman who would smile and nod and do what the powerful men in the room told her to do." Her eyes moved from Marcus to Brandon to Victoria, holding each gaze for a long moment before moving on. "But this dinner is over. Not because you have decided it is over, because I have decided it is over." Brandon started to object, his mouth opening to say something dismissive or angry or both. But Sophie held up one hand, silencing him with the same gesture his father had used on him earlier. The irony was not lost on anyone at the table. "My flight back to Tokyo does not leave until tomorrow afternoon," Sophie continued, "which means we have time. Time for you to do the due diligence you should have done in the first place. Time for you to understand what you are actually negotiating for. Time for you to decide whether you want a real partnership or whether you want to continue trying to execute a flawed acquisition based on compromised information." She reached up to touch the crane and moon pin on her lapel. drawing strength from the physical connection to her grandfather's legacy. And if we meet again tomorrow, it will be to discuss a very different kind of deal. Not an acquisition, not a takeover, a partnership based on mutual respect, based on real understanding of what Nakamura Corporation is and what it stands for, based on the recognition that cultural heritage and corporate strategy are not separate things, but two aspects of the same whole. Marcus was watching her with an expression that was difficult to read. Calculation, certainly, reassessment, but also perhaps a glimmer of something that might have been admiration. This was not the frightened girl who had sat silently while they talked over her. This was a woman who understood power and was not afraid to use it. And one more thing, Sophie added, her voice steady and clear. If there is a new deal, if there is a real partnership, then Dr. Elena Torres will be part of my team, as my chief cultural advisor. Her academic credentials, which were so unjustly destroyed, will be publicly reinstated. She will be given the resources to complete the work that was stolen from her. And Professor Whitmore's fraudulent analysis will be exposed for what it is. She looked at Elena, who was staring at her with wide eyes, as if unable to believe what she was hearing. "It is not negotiable," Sophie finished. "Those are my terms. You can accept them, or you can walk away and try to explain to your shareholders why you lost the biggest international partnership opportunity your company has seen in a decade, because you were too proud to admit you made a mistake." The ultimatum hung in the air, clear and unambiguous. There was no room for misunderstanding, no wiggle room for negotiation. Sophie had laid out her position, and she was not backing down. For the first time in perhaps his entire career, Marcus Blackwell found himself in a position where he was not the one dictating terms, where the person sitting across from him had more leverage than he did, where walking away would cost him more than staying. The power had not just shifted, it had been completely, irrevocably inverted. And the woman, who had been invisible for 93 minutes, was now the only person in the room who mattered. The ultimatum hung in the air like a blade suspended over all of them, its edge sharp and unforgiving. Sophie Nakamura Sterling stood beside the table, one hand still resting lightly on the crane and moonpin at her lapel, the other at her side, steady and sure. She was no longer the trembling girl who had broken a water glass and whispered desperation in Japanese. She was something else now, something that Marcus Blackwell was only beginning to understand. She was power that had learned to recognize itself. Brandon Blackwell was the first to break the silence, and he did so in exactly the way Sophie had expected, with scorn, with mockery, with the kind of dismissive arrogance that came from a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered, and who genuinely could not conceive of a world where he was not the one in control. "This is insane." He let out a short, harsh laugh that had no humor in it. "You cannot be serious. We are supposed to restructure a billion-dollar merger because you want to hire the waitress? Because some academic has a grudge against our consultant?" He looked around the table as if expecting support, as if certain that his father and Victoria would back him up, would restore the natural order of things where serious business people did not let themselves be dictated to by young women who got emotional at dinner. But neither Marcus nor Victoria spoke. They were both watching Sophie with expressions that Brandon, in his self-absorbed fury, did not recognize. Calculation, reassessment, the look of people who understood that the game had changed and were trying to figure out the new rules before committing to a move. Sophie let Brandon's words fade into silence before she responded. When she did, her voice was quiet, but it carried the kind of cold, absolute certainty that made Brandon's bluster sound hollow by comparison. "Then there is no merger, Mr. Blackwell." 5 words, simple, direct, final. She let them settle for a long moment before continuing, her eyes moving from Brandon to Marcus to Victoria, making sure each of them understood that she was not bluffing, not negotiating, not leaving room for compromise. "There is no deal. You can walk away from this table right now. You can go back to your office and your board and your shareholders. You can explain to them that you lost the biggest international partnership opportunity your company has seen in a decade. You can tell them that it fell apart because you based your entire strategy on the analysis of a consultant who had undisclosed conflicts of interest, because you did not do proper due diligence, because you were too arrogant to question an expert whose conclusions happened to align with what you wanted to hear. Each sentence landed like a hammer blow, precise and devastating. Sophie was not raising her voice. She did not need to. The truth of what she was saying gave her words all the force they needed. Or, she continued, and now there was something almost gentle in her tone, as if she were offering a lifeline to drowning men. You can stay. You can acknowledge that you made mistakes. You can do the work that should have been done from the beginning. You can build something real, something that actually has value beyond the numbers on a spreadsheet. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a note of something that might have been compassion or might have been contempt. It was hard to tell which. The choice is yours, Mr. Blackwell. The moon or the reeds, cold ambition or meaningful partnership. You can fly alone to a place where the air is thin and the company is non-existent. Or you can choose something different, something harder, something that requires you to actually listen and learn and admit when you are wrong. Brandon's face had gone from red to a deeper, uglier shade of crimson. His hands were clenched on the table so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. Sophie could see him struggling with himself, fighting the urge to say something that would make the situation even worse than it already was. But it was Victoria Chen who spoke next, her lawyer's mind already working through the implications, the risks, the potential exposures. Her voice was tight, controlled, professional, even in the face of what had to be the most surreal negotiation of her career. Miss Nakamura Sterling, I understand that you are upset. The revelation about Professor Whitmore's potential conflicts is certainly concerning, and I assure you that we will investigate it thoroughly. But restructuring the entire deal, bringing in an outside consultant with no established credentials in corporate advising, making public accusations against a respected academic, these are not small requests. They carry significant risk. It was a reasonable objection, delivered reasonably. Victoria was trying to find a middle ground, trying to salvage what she could of the original plan, while appearing to take Sophie's concerns seriously. It was good lawyering. It was also completely beside the point. Sophie turned her full attention to Victoria, and there was something in her eyes that made the older woman stop talking mid-thought. Dr. Torres has more expertise in the subject we are discussing than anyone at this table. More than Professor Whitmore, certainly, since his foundational work is based on mistranslations and flawed analysis. More than your other consultants, who are just echoing Whitmore's conclusions. More than any of you, who did not bother to do the most basic research into what you were actually acquiring. She gestured to Elena, who had been standing silently through this entire exchange, her face carefully neutral, but her eyes bright with something that might have been hope, or might have been disbelief. Her credentials were destroyed by someone who felt threatened by her work. That does not make her less qualified. It makes the system that destroyed her corrupt. And if you cannot see the difference between someone who lost their career because they told an inconvenient truth, and someone who built their career on suppressing that truth, then we have nothing more to discuss. The moral clarity of it was stunning. Sophie was not asking them to take her word for Elena's qualifications. She was asking them to recognize an injustice and choose which side of it they wanted to be on. It was a challenge that went beyond business, beyond negotiation tactics, beyond the usual calculus of risk and reward. It was a question of character. Marcus Blackwell had been silent through all of this, his pale blue eyes moving from speaker to speaker, his face revealing nothing. But Sophie could see something happening behind that granite mask, some internal calculation, some weighing of options that went deeper than simple business strategy. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, measured, the tone of a man who was choosing his words with great care. Miss Nakamura Sterling, may I ask you a question? Sophie inclined her head slightly, granting permission. This partnership you are proposing, this new deal built on mutual respect and cultural understanding, do you actually believe it can work, or is this simply a negotiating tactic to extract better terms? It was a more honest question than Sophie had expected from him. There was no hostility in it, no dismissiveness, just genuine curiosity about whether she meant what she was saying or whether this was all an elaborate bluff. Sophie considered her answer carefully before responding. I believe it can work if you are willing to actually change. Not just the terms of the deal, but your entire approach. If you are willing to listen instead of dictate. if you are willing to see value in things that cannot be easily quantified, if you are willing to admit that there are perspectives and expertise that you do not possess and need to acquire. She paused, then added softly, "My grandfather built Nakamura Corporation on the principle that the best solutions come from integrating seemingly opposite forces: art and technology, tradition and innovation, Eastern philosophy and Western pragmatism. He called it flying between the moon and the reeds. It is harder than choosing one or the other, but it is also the only way to build something that lasts." Marcus absorbed this in silence. Then he did something that surprised everyone at the table, including himself. He stood up. Not to leave, not to storm out in anger, but simply to level the playing field, to acknowledge that this was a conversation between equals, not a negotiation where one party held all the power. He looked at Sophie for a long moment, and then at Elena, and then back to Sophie. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that had not been there before. The weight of a decision that would define not just this deal, but potentially the rest of his career. "I have spent 40 years building Sterling Whitmore, 40 years of 80-hour weeks and missed birthdays and marriages that failed because I was never home. 40 years of flying to the moon, as your grandfather would say." He glanced at his son, and there was something almost sad in his expression. "I looked at Brandon earlier tonight, and I saw myself reflected back. The same hunger for success, the same willingness to crush anything that gets in the way, the same certainty that the only thing that matters is winning." Brandon shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly not sure where his father was going with this. Marcus continued, his gaze moving around the restaurant, taking in the opulence, the quiet power, the careful cultivation of an atmosphere that spoke of money and influence, and the kind of success that most people could only dream of. "I reached the moon, built an empire, made more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. And you want to know what I found up there?" He looked back at Sophie, and for the first time all evening, there was something raw in his eyes. Something real. Nothing. Cold. Silence. The view is spectacular, but there is nobody to share it with. No warmth. No meaning beyond the achievement itself. The admission hung in the air, vulnerable and honest, in a way that men like Marcus Blackwell rarely allowed themselves to be. Brandon was staring at his father as if seeing him for the first time. Victoria had stopped taking notes, her pen hovering frozen above her legal pad. Marcus took a slow breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was steady, but there was a thread of something new woven through it. Not quite hope, but perhaps the beginning of it. "Your grandfather's philosophy. The crane that flies between the moon and the reeds. I have been thinking about it since you explained it, thinking about what it would mean to actually try to build that way, to pursue success without sacrificing everything else, to achieve without destroying." He paused, and Sophie could see him wrestling with something, some decision that was costing him more than any business negotiation ever had. "I do not know if I can do it," he said finally. "I have been flying one way for so long that I am not sure I remember how to change direction, but I am willing to try." He turned to face Sophie fully, and for the first time since they had sat down at this table, she saw him truly see her, not as a signature on a contract, not as an obstacle to be managed, as a person with knowledge and perspective that he needed. "Tomorrow morning, 10 a.m., my office. We start over. From the beginning. A real negotiation for a real partnership. No more assumptions, no more cultural arrogance, no more taking the easy path because it confirms what we want to believe." He extended his hand across the table, not as a gesture of dominance, but as an offer of equal partnership. "Do we have an agreement?" Sophie looked at the offered hand, and then at Elena, who had been standing silently through this entire exchange, her eyes wide with an emotion that she was struggling to contain. Sophie saw in Elena's face what this moment meant, not just vindication, though that was part of it, but the possibility of something more, the chance to reclaim not just her credentials, but her purpose, her work, her identity as something more than invisible. Sophie reached out and took Marcus's hand. Her grip was firm, steady, equal to his. "We have an agreement tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. The handshake lasted for a long moment, and everyone at the table understood that what was being sealed was not the end of something but the beginning. Not a conclusion, but a commitment to try something different, something harder, something that might actually matter. Marcus then did something else unexpected. He turned to Elena, and he offered his hand to her as well. Dr. Torres. The use of her title was deliberate, a public acknowledgement of her expertise and her worth. Elena stared at the offered hand for a heartbeat, and Sophie could see the emotions playing across her face. 5 years of being invisible, 5 years of being dismissed, and now this. Recognition from someone with real power to make a difference. Elena took his hand, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. Mr. Blackwell, I will be there. Marcus nodded, and the handshake between them carried its own weight. Not the weight of forgiveness, exactly. Elena's career had still been destroyed. Those 5 years could not be given back. But perhaps the weight of acknowledgement, of a powerful man recognizing that he had been complicit, however unwittingly, in a system that crushed people for telling the truth. It was not everything, but it was something. Brandon had remained seated through all of this, his face a mask of barely suppressed fury and confusion. He clearly wanted to object, wanted to argue, wanted to reassert some control over a situation that had spiraled completely out of his grasp. But one look at his father's face told him that this was not the time, that whatever battles he wanted to fight would have to wait. Victoria was already making notes, her legal mind switching gears from defending the old deal to structuring the new one. I will need to brief our team tonight. We will need new valuations, new consultants, new framework agreements. This is going to take significant work. Then we start working, Marcus said simply. Cancel my morning meetings. I want our best people on this. And I want them to know that this is the priority. Everything else can wait. He looked at Sophie and Elena. Is there anything else you need from us tonight? Sophie shook her head. No, we have said what needed to be said. The rest can wait until tomorrow. Marcus nodded. He gathered his things, and Victoria did the same, her documents and notes already organized with the efficiency of someone who had learned to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Brandon moved slowly, reluctantly, shooting one last look at Sophie that combined resentment with something that might have been grudging respect. As the Sterling Whitmore team prepared to leave, the other diners in Ethelard watched with undisguised curiosity. The entire restaurant had been following the drama at Table 7, though most of them had no idea what had actually transpired. They just knew that something unusual had happened, something that involved raised voices and broken glass, and a waitress who had somehow become central to a negotiation that had started the evening looking very different. Julian, the manager, hovered nervously near the entrance, clearly torn between his duty to maintain the restaurant's atmosphere of refined calm and his burning curiosity about what had just happened at his most important table. Marcus paused at the edge of the table, looking back at Sophie one more time. Your grandfather, Hiroshi Nakamura. I wish I could have met him. Sophie felt a tightness in her throat. He would have liked this, the challenge, the possibility of building something new. He always said that the most interesting moments in business were the ones where you had to choose between the easy path and the right one. Marcus smiled, a real smile that transformed his usually stern face. And he would have been proud of you tonight, standing up for what he built, finding your voice when it mattered most. He nodded once more, then turned and walked toward the exit, his team following behind him like the wake of a ship that had just changed course. And then they were gone, leaving Sophie and Elena standing beside Table 7 in the sudden quiet of the aftermath. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The adrenaline that had been sustaining Sophie through the confrontation was beginning to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a trembling in her hands that she could no longer quite control. She sank back into her chair, suddenly aware of how much energy it had taken to stand up to Marcus Blackwell, to deliver her ultimatum, to hold her ground. Hold her. Elena remained standing for a moment longer, and then, breaking every rule of protocol that governed the relationship between servers and customers, she pulled out the chair next to Sophie and sat down. Not across from her, but beside her. Two women who had stood together against forces that had tried to make them invisible. Julian took a half step forward, as if to object to this breach of decorum. But one look from Elena stopped him in his tracks. He retreated, deciding that whatever had happened at Table 7 was above his pay grade and not worth the risk of interfering. Sophie turned to look at Elena, and for the first time all evening, she let her carefully maintained composure crack, her eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of sadness or defeat. They were something else: relief, gratitude, the overwhelming emotion of someone who had been drowning and had just found solid ground. "Did that really just happen?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She switched to Japanese without thinking about it, the language that felt safest, most like home. "Watashi wa yume o mite iru no desho ka?" Am I dreaming? Elena reached out and took Sophie's hand, squeezing it gently. Her own hands were trembling too, Sophie noticed. 5 years of waiting, 5 years of being invisible, and suddenly the possibility of vindication, of restoration, of being seen again. "Yume de wa arimasen," Elena replied softly in Japanese. "Kore wa genjitsu desu. Anata wa sore o jitsugen sasemashita." This is not a dream. This is real. You made it happen. Sophie shook her head, her tears spilling over now. "Watashi tachi ga sore o jitsugen sasemashita. Anata ga inakereba, watashi wa mada chimoku shite imashite." We made it happen. Without you, I would still be silent. They sat in silence for a moment, hands clasped. Two women who had been strangers 3 hours ago and who were now bound together by something deeper than friendship, by shared pain and shared courage and shared victory over the forces that had tried to diminish them. "Tore-san," Sophie said finally, using the respectful Japanese honorific that Elena had used for her. "Watashi ga teian shita koto wa anata ga nozomu koto desu ka? Honto ni? Is what I proposed something you actually want, truly?" Elena looked down at their joined hands. Her voice when she spoke was thick with emotion that she was no longer trying to hide. "For 5 years," she said in English, the words coming slowly as if each one had weight, "I have been a ghost. I studied beautiful things. I wrote about legacies that last for centuries, about art and philosophy and meaning. And I lived a life where I was forgotten the moment I walked away from a table." She looked up, meeting Sophie's eyes, and Sophie saw in them the accumulated pain of those 5 years, the daily humiliation of being invisible, the slowly dying hope that anything would ever change. "What you are offering me is not just a job," Elena continued, "not just my credentials back, though that matters more than I can say. You are offering me the chance to be seen again, to have my work matter, to be Dr. Elena Torres again instead of just Elena the waitress who people look through like she is made of glass." Her voice broke slightly on the last word, and she had to pause to collect herself. "So, yes," she said finally, her voice steadying with the strength of absolute certainty. "Yes, Sophie, it is what I want, more than you could ever know." Sophie felt something warm spreading through her chest, pushing back the exhaustion and the fear and the doubt. She had made the right choice, standing up to Marcus, demanding that Elena be part of the New Deal, using the small amount of power she had discovered she possessed to try to right an injustice that had nothing to do with her directly, but everything to do with the kind of world she wanted to live in. "Then we do this together," Sophie said firmly. "Tomorrow morning, we face them together. We build this partnership together. And we make sure that what happened to you never happens to anyone else, if we have the power to prevent it." Elena nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. They sat together in silence as the restaurant slowly returned to normal around them. Other diners went back to their conversations, though more than a few kept glancing in their direction. The servers resumed their careful choreography of service, though they gave Table 7 a wide berth, sensing that something important had happened there, and that it was not yet quite finished. Julian eventually approached, his usual nervous energy somewhat subdued by the weight of whatever had transpired at his most exclusive table. "Miss Nakamura Sterling, is there anything else I can get for you this evening? Perhaps some dessert? Coffee?" Sophie looked at the Dover sole that still sat untouched on her plate, now cold and completely unappetizing. She had not eaten a single bite all evening, but the thought of food made her stomach turn. "Just the check, please. And please add a gratuity for Dr. Torres that reflects the extraordinary service she has provided tonight." The use of Elena's title was deliberate, a small but meaningful gesture of respect. Julian blinked, clearly confused about how the waitress had become doctor, and why she was now sitting at the table like a guest. But he was too well trained to ask questions. Of course, Miss Sterling, right away!" As he hurried off, Sophie turned back to Elena. You should go home, get some rest. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. Elena nodded, but she did not immediately move to stand. Instead, she looked at Sophie with an expression that was hard to read. Sophie-san, she said, using the Japanese honorific with a warmth that made Sophie's chest tighten. I need you to understand something. What you did tonight, standing up to them, demanding that I be part of the New Deal, it was brave, braver than you might realize. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But tomorrow, when we walk into Marcus Blackwell's office, the dynamic will be different. Tonight, you had the element of surprise. You had moral authority. You had them off balance. Tomorrow, they will have had time to think, to strategize, to find ways to regain control. Sophie nodded slowly. I know, but we will be ready for that. We have truth on our side. We have expertise. We have each other. Elena smiled, and it was the first real smile Sophie had seen from her all evening. Yes, we do. And that is more than I have had for a very long time. She stood finally, smoothing down her uniform with hands that were steadier now than they had been. I will see you tomorrow, Sophie-san. 10 a.m., Sterling Whitmore Tower. 10 a.m., Sophie confirmed. And Elena, thank you for speaking to me in Japanese when I needed it most, for seeing me when no one else did, for being brave enough to tell your story even though it hurt. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. Thank you for listening, for believing me, for choosing to do something about it instead of just feeling bad and moving on. She gave a small formal bow, the kind that spoke of deep respect and gratitude. Then she turned and walked away, her posture straighter than it had been at the beginning of the evening, her steps lighter despite the long hours on her feet. Sophie watched her go, and then she turned her attention to the crane and moonpin on her lapel. She traced the outline of the crane in flight, feeling the texture of the gold inlay under her fingertips. I hope I made you proud, grandfather, she whispered in Japanese. I tried to fly between the moon and the reeds. I tried to choose the harder path because it was the right one. The pin offered no answer, of course, but Sophie felt, in the quiet of her own heart, that somewhere beyond the veil of death, Hiroshi Nakamura was smiling. His granddaughter had found her voice. She had stood up for his legacy. She had chosen partnership over capitulation, dignity over expediency, justice over convenience. And in doing so, she had begun to understand what it truly meant to be his heir. The check arrived, discreetly presented in a leather folder. Sophie glanced at the total and did not even blink at the astronomical number. Her father's company was paying, and besides, the money seemed almost irrelevant compared to what had actually happened at this table tonight. She added a tip for Elena that was larger than most people earned in a month, signed the receipt, and stood to leave. As she walked through the restaurant toward the exit, she was aware of eyes following her. Curious stares, whispered speculation. The young woman who had somehow turned a business dinner into a dramatic confrontation that had left the titans of Sterling Whitmore looking shaken. Let them wonder, Sophie thought. Let them speculate. The truth of what happened here tonight belonged to her and Elena and no one else. She stepped out into the cool Manhattan evening, and the sudden rush of air felt like freedom. The city stretched out before her in all directions, vast and complicated and full of challenges that she was only beginning to understand. But she was ready for them now, because she had learned something tonight that she had not fully understood before. Her voice mattered, her grandfather's legacy mattered, and when the invisible finally chose to speak, the whole world had no choice but to listen. Tomorrow morning would bring new challenges, new negotiations, new battles to fight. But tonight, standing on the steps of Ethelard with the city lights reflecting in her eyes, Sophie Nakamura Sterling allowed herself to feel something she had not felt in a very long time. Hope. And beside her, though she could not see it, the spirit of her grandfather smiled and whispered words that only she could hear. Yokuyata mago musume, the crane is learning to fly. Well done, granddaughter. The crane is learning to fly. The morning sun cut through the glass and steel canyons of Manhattan with the kind of sharp crystalline clarity that made everything look both beautiful and unforgiving. Sophie Nakamura Sterling stood in the lobby of Sterling Whitmore Tower, looking up at the building that soared above her like a monument to the kind of power she had challenged the night before. The kind of power that could crush you if you were not careful. The kind of power that just maybe could be redirected if you were brave enough and smart enough and lucky enough. She had not slept much. How could she? The adrenaline from the dinner at Ethelard had kept her awake for hours, replaying every moment, every word, every shift in power. She had paced her hotel room until 3 in the morning, touching the crane and moon pin on her nightstand over and over, as if drawing strength from the physical connection to her grandfather's wisdom. When sleep finally came, it had been fitful, filled with dreams of broken glass and whispered Japanese, and eyes that finally saw her. But despite the exhaustion, Sophie felt more awake than she had in months, maybe years. There was a clarity to this morning, a sense of purpose that made the lack of sleep irrelevant. She had found her voice. She had used her power. And today, she would see if the promises made in the heat of crisis would hold in the cold light of morning. She was not alone. Beside her stood Elena Torres, and the transformation was so complete that Sophie had to look twice to make sure it was the same woman she had left at Ethelard the night before. Gone was the plain black uniform, the apron, the weary posture of someone who had learned to make herself small. In their place was a woman who looked every inch the scholar she had once been, the expert she had always deserved to be recognized as. The suit was charcoal gray, impeccably tailored to fit her frame with the kind of precision that spoke of money spent wisely. Sophie had arranged for a personal shopper to meet Elena at dawn, had provided a credit card with explicit instructions to spare no expense. The cut was modern but conservative, professional without being corporate. Beneath it, a silk shell in deep emerald that brought out the warmth in Elena's skin tone and made her dark eyes even more striking. Her hair, which had been pulled back in a severe ponytail the night before, now fell in soft waves around her face, professionally styled, but not overly formal. But it was not the clothes that made the difference, Sophie realized as she watched Elena move through the lobby. It was the way she carried herself. The way she stood with her shoulders back and her chin up, claiming space instead of apologizing for occupying it. The way she met the eyes of the people passing through the lobby instead of looking down or away. The way she moved as if she had every right to be there. Every right to walk into the executive offices of one of the most powerful firms in Manhattan and negotiate as an equal. The real transformation, Sophie understood, had happened the night before, when Elena had been seen, when her expertise had been acknowledged, when she had been given permission, finally, to stop being invisible. The suit was just armor for a battle she had already won in her own heart. "Ready?" Sophie asked softly as they approached the elevator bank. Elena took a deep breath, and Sophie saw her hands tremble slightly before she clasped them together and stilled them through sheer force of will. The night before had been a whirlwind, a series of impossibilities stacked one on top of another until reality itself seemed to have shifted. But the morning brought doubt, the small voice that whispered that perhaps it had all been too good to be true, that perhaps Marcus Blackwell would have second thoughts in the harsh light of day. "I have been preparing for a meeting like this for 5 years, Elena said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I just never thought it would actually happen. Part of me still does not believe it is real." Sophie reached out and squeezed Elena's arm briefly, a gesture of solidarity and support. "It is real. And we do this together. Whatever happens in that room, we face it side by side." They walked to the elevator, their footsteps echoing on the polished marble floor. The security guard at the desk looked up, recognized Sophie from the previous evening's arrangements, and nodded them through without challenge. He did not recognize Elena, of course. Why would he? She had been invisible for so long that even now, dressed for success and walking with purpose, she was just another professional woman in a building full of them. But that would change, Sophie thought as the elevator doors opened smoothly. That was going to change starting today. As the elevator rose, Sophie watched the city fall away below them through the glass walls. 47 floors up to Marcus Blackwell's office. 47 floors to rise above the street level where Elena had spent the last 5 years serving people who looked through her. 47 floors to a negotiation that would determine not just a business deal, but the shape of their futures, the trajectory of their lives, the legacy they would leave behind. The elevator was silent, except for the soft mechanical hum of its ascent. Sophie glanced at Elena and saw her staring at her own reflection in the polished steel doors, as if trying to reconcile the woman she saw now with the woman she had been just hours before, trying to believe that this version of herself, confident and professional and worthy, was not just a costume she was wearing, but something real and permanent. "Elena," Sophie said softly, and the other woman turned to look at her. "You belong here. Your expertise, your knowledge, your years of study and research and sacrifice, they earned you this seat at the table. Do not let anyone, not even yourself, make you forget that. You are not here because I demanded it. You are here because you deserve it." Elena's eyes glistened with sudden emotion, but she blinked it back, nodded once, firmly. "Thank you for believing that, for making them believe it too, for giving me the chance to prove it is true." The elevator chimed softly as it reached the 47th floor, and the door slid open onto a world of quiet, expensive power. The reception area was all floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist furniture, designed to intimidate and impress in equal measure. But Sophie had learned something important the night before. Impressive surroundings were just that, surroundings. They had no power unless you gave it to them. And she was done giving her power away to rooms and buildings and men who thought they owned the world. The receptionist, a polished woman in her 40s with perfect posture and a professional smile, looked up as they approached. "Miss Nakamura Sterling, Dr. Torres, Mr. Blackwell is expecting you. Please follow me." The use of Elena's title was deliberate, Sophie noted with satisfaction. Marcus had clearly instructed his staff on how to address their visitors. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it mattered. It was acknowledgement of who Elena was, not just who Sophie needed her to be. It was recognition that this was a woman with credentials and expertise worthy of respect. They were led down a corridor lined with photographs of Sterling Whitmore's greatest triumphs. Mergers and acquisitions, groundbreaking deals, Marcus shaking hands with presidents and CEOs and titans of industry. A visual history of power accumulating power, success breeding success. But Sophie noticed something as they walked past image after image. In all these photographs, Marcus stood alone or surrounded by other men in suits. There was no warmth in them, no joy, just the cold satisfaction of victory, the grim pleasure of winning. It was a lonely kind of success, Sophie thought, the kind her grandfather had warned her about, flying to the moon and finding nothing but cold silence waiting there. The conference room door opened onto a space that was both smaller and more intimate than Sophie had expected. No massive boardroom table crowded with lawyers and analysts and junior associates armed with laptops and briefcases. Just a round table, seating for 6, positioned near the floor-to-ceiling windows with their spectacular view of Central Park, stretching out green and vast below them. Marcus Blackwell stood near the window, his back to them, looking out at the city. When he turned at the sound of the door opening, Sophie saw immediately that something about him was different. The hard edges were still there in the lines of his face, the set of his shoulders, the pale blue eyes that had intimidated so many people over so many years. But there was something else now, too, something that looked almost like uncertainty, as if he had spent the night, as Sophie had, replaying the dinner at Ethelard and wondering if the promises made in crisis would survive the morning. He was alone. No Brandon, with his predatory smile and hollow ambition. No Victoria, with her sharp legal mind and sharper tongue. No army of junior associates ready to take notes and provide backup and run interference. Just Marcus, in a suit that was somehow less armor-like than the one he had worn the night before, standing in a room that felt more like a place for honest conversation than corporate combat. "Miss Nakamura Sterling, Dr. Torres." He greeted them with a nod, and Sophie noticed that he met Elena's eyes directly, without the dismissive glance over that powerful men so often gave to people they considered beneath them. "Thank you for coming. Please sit." They took seats at the round table, the 3 of them forming a triangle of equal distances. No head of the table, no power position. Just 3 people about to have a conversation that would determine whether last night's dramatic confrontation would lead to something real and lasting, or whether it would collapse under the weight of morning's doubts. Marcus sat down last, and for a long moment, he simply looked at them. Sophie could see him choosing his words, weighing them, trying to find the right way to begin this conversation. For a man who had built his career on decisive action and confident pronouncements, this visible uncertainty was striking. It made him seem more human, more real. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. I spent most of last night thinking about what happened at Ethelard. About what you said, Miss Nakamura Sterling, regarding respect and listening and cultural understanding. About what Dr. Torres revealed regarding our consultant's compromised analysis and the injustice she suffered. And I realized something that I should have realized a long time ago. He paused, and Sophie saw his jaw tighten as if the next words were physically difficult to speak. I have been very good at making money, at identifying opportunities and executing deals and maximizing shareholder value. I have built an empire that employs thousands of people and generates billions in revenue. But I have not been good at seeing people, at understanding that behind every transaction are human beings with expertise and perspective and knowledge that I do not possess. I have been flying to the moon for so long, chasing success and power and validation, that I forgot there was anywhere else to go. I forgot about the reeds. The admission was quiet, almost tentative, as if Marcus was not quite sure how to do this, how to be vulnerable in a professional setting. But he pushed through it, his pale blue eyes moving from Sophie to Elena and back. I owe you both an apology. Miss Nakamura Sterling, I treated you as a formality last night, a signature that I needed to acquire, not a partner whose input I should value. I made assumptions about your capabilities based on your age and your gender, and the fact that you were not loud or aggressive in the ways I have learned to recognize as strength. That was arrogant and wrong, and I'm deeply sorry. He turned his full attention to Elena, and Sophie saw something in his face that she had not seen the night before. Not just respect, but something closer to remorse. And Dr. Torres, I was complicit, however unknowingly, in a system that allowed Professor Whitmore to use my firm's resources to pursue a personal vendetta. Your career was destroyed because you told the truth, because you challenged established authority with better research and more rigorous analysis. And I nearly helped destroy your life's work a second time because I did not do proper due diligence, because I took the easy path of accepting an expert opinion that confirmed what I wanted to believe. For that, I am deeply sorry. Elena sat very still, her hands folded on the table in front of her. Sophie could see her throat working as she swallowed hard, processing this apology from a man who probably apologized to almost no one, whose power and position usually shielded him from ever having to admit fault. When Elena finally spoke, her voice was steady and clear. I accept your apology, Mr. Blackwell, but I need you to understand that an apology, while appreciated, is not sufficient. I need action. I need my credentials restored, my work acknowledged, my research given the platform it deserves. I need Professor Whitmore held accountable for what he did, not just to me, but to the other people he has damaged over the years. Words are easy. It is the follow-through that matters. Marcus nodded, and there was something that looked like respect in his eyes, a recognition that this woman was not going to be satisfied with empty gestures, that she had been dismissed and degraded for too long to accept anything less than real, concrete change. You are absolutely right, he said, which is why I spent the rest of last night making calls. My legal team is already reviewing Whitmore's consultancy contract for breaches of fiduciary duty and failure to disclose conflicts of interest. We have grounds for legal action, and we will pursue it. I have personally contacted the president of Columbia University to inform them of the situation and to request a formal review of the academic fraud case that led to your dismissal. I have made it clear that Sterling Whitmore will be watching closely to ensure that review is conducted with the rigor and independence it deserves. He pulled a folder from beside his chair and slid it across the table to Elena. And I have reached out to 3 independent experts in Japanese art history, all recommended by the Japanese Cultural Ministry, to conduct a new valuation of the Nakamura Foundation. Their work will replace Whitmore's analysis entirely. We will base our decisions on facts, not on the opinions of someone with undisclosed conflicts of interest. Elena opened the folder with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the first page. It was a contract. Detailed, professional, real. This offers you the position of Chief Cultural Advisor to the merged entity that we are going to create, Marcus continued. It includes full restoration of your doctoral title in all public communications, funding for you to complete and publish your research, and the resources to curate the exhibition that was taken from you 5 years ago. The salary is generous, the benefits comprehensive, and the terms are non-negotiable. Because you earned this, Dr. Torres, not through favors or connections, but through expertise and integrity. Through the courage to tell the truth, even when it cost you everything. Elena stared at the contract, her eyes filling with tears that she did not try to hide. 5 years of waiting. 5 years of being invisible. 5 years of wondering if anyone would ever acknowledge what had been done to her, if justice would ever come. And now this. Not just words, not just promises, but a contract with her name on it, and terms that recognized her worth. She started, then stopped, her voice catching. She cleared her throat and tried again. I do not know what to say. Say yes, Marcus replied simply, and then help us build something that actually matters. Elena looked at Sophie, who nodded encouragingly. Then she looked back at Marcus, and when she spoke, her voice was stronger, more certain, carrying the weight of a decision that would change her life. Yes, I accept. Marcus smiled, a real smile that transformed his usually stern face, and extended his hand across the table. Elena took it, and the handshake between them was firm, equal, a sealing of a partnership that was based not on hierarchy, but on mutual need and mutual respect. Then Marcus turned his attention to Sophie, and his expression became more serious. And now, Miss Nakamura Sterling, we need to talk about what a real partnership between our companies would actually look like. For the next 3 hours, they talked. Not as adversaries locked in combat or as master and subordinate following orders, but as three intelligent people trying to solve a complex problem together. Marcus asked questions, real questions, about the Nakamura Corporation's philosophy, its approach to product development, its relationship with its customers and its employees. Sophie answered honestly, sometimes admitting when she did not know something, sometimes asking Elena to provide historical or cultural context that she herself could not. Elena, for her part, was brilliant. She explained the concept of cultural capital in terms that made business sense to Marcus, showing him with data and examples how the Nakamura Foundation was not just a charitable endeavor, but a strategic asset that generated goodwill, brand loyalty, and competitive differentiation in a crowded technology market. She walked him through the philosophy of the crane and the moon, helping him understand that it was not just poetry or abstract idealism, but a practical framework for balancing short-term gains with long-term sustainability, for building a company that could thrive across generations instead of burning bright and fast and then collapsing. By the time they broke for lunch, the outlines of a new deal were taking shape. Not an acquisition where one company swallowed another, but a true merger of equals. A joint board with Sophie as co-chair, her voice given equal weight to Marcus's. The Nakamura Foundation not just preserved but expanded, with a new wing in New York that Elena would direct, bringing Japanese art and philosophy to Western audiences. A commitment to integrating traditional Japanese design principles into Sterling Whitmore's approach to innovation and product development. A cultural exchange program that would send Sterling Whitmore employees to Japan to learn from Nakamura's craftspeople and bring Nakamura employees to New York to understand Western markets and business practices. It was ambitious. It was complicated. It would require both companies to change in fundamental ways, to step outside their comfort zones, to learn new languages, both literal and metaphorical. But it was also, Sophie realized, exactly what her grandfather would have wanted. Not the easy path of simple acquisition, but the harder, richer path of real integration. Not flying only to the moon or staying only in the reeds, but learning to move between them with grace and purpose. As they were finishing up the last details of the preliminary framework, Victoria Chen appeared in the doorway, looking somewhat chastened but still professional. She had clearly been briefed on the new direction. And while Sophie suspected she had reservations about the dramatic shift in strategy, she was too good a lawyer to voice them in front of the clients. Mr. Blackwell, I have the revised term sheet ready for your review. And I have news regarding Professor Whitmore. Marcus looked up. Go ahead. Victoria stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. After you contacted Columbia last night, they launched their own internal investigation. It turns out that Dr. Torres was not the first junior academic that Whitmore had targeted. There were 3 others over the past decade, all of whom had research that contradicted or complicated his work in ways that threatened his reputation, all of whom experienced similar patterns of accusation, hearing, technical exoneration, followed by career destruction through unofficial blacklisting. Elena's hands clenched on the table, her knuckles going white. Sophie reached out and placed her hand over Elena's, offering silent support. 4 victims, not just Elena, but 3 others whose careers and dreams had been destroyed by one man's ego and fear. Victoria continued, her voice professional, but carrying an undercurrent of satisfaction. The university has placed Whitmore on immediate administrative leave, pending a full review. The Metropolitan Museum has suspended him from his board position. And several of his former students, people whose careers were built on his mentorship and his framework, have come forward to say that they have concerns about the academic rigor of work they co-authored with him. His entire body of scholarship is now under scrutiny. His career is, for all practical purposes, over. There was a long silence as this sank in. Justice. Not perfect, not fast enough to give Elena back the 5 years she had lost, or to undo the damage done to the 3 other scholars, whose names they did not even know yet. But justice nonetheless. The man who had destroyed careers to protect his own reputation was finally being held accountable. The system that had protected him for so long was finally, belatedly, recognizing its failure. Good, Marcus said simply. Then he looked at Elena. I know this does not undo what was done to you. I know it does not give you back the years you lost, but I hope it provides some measure of closure, some sense that the truth, however delayed, does eventually matter. Elena nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. Sophie squeezed her hand, and Elena squeezed back, hard. They signed the preliminary agreements that afternoon, with the understanding that the legal teams would spend the next several weeks working out the full details, the specific terms and conditions and safeguards that would govern this new entity they were creating. But the fundamental commitment was made, sealed with signatures and handshakes and the kind of trust that could only come from having been tested in crisis and choosing, against all conventional wisdom, to try something different. Sterling Whitmore and Nakamura Corporation were going to attempt something difficult and meaningful together. They were going to try to build a company that valued both profit and purpose, both innovation and tradition, both ambition and community. They were going to fly between the moon and the reeds. The negotiations that followed were complex and often contentious. Legal teams from both sides spent weeks hammering out details, arguing over clauses, protecting their clients' interests while trying to honor the spirit of partnership that had been established in that initial meeting. There were moments when Sophie wondered if the whole thing would collapse under the weight of institutional resistance to change, of lawyers trained to see every interaction as adversarial, of executives uncomfortable with a structure that shared power rather than concentrating it. But every time the talks threatened to break down, Sophie would touch the crane and moon pin and remember why they were doing this. Not for easy success, but for meaningful partnership. Not because it was simple, but because it was right. And she would find the strength to push forward, to insist on terms that honored both her grandfather's legacy and the new vision they were trying to build. Elena, for her part, threw herself into building her team and developing plans for the New York wing of the Nakamura Foundation. She faced skepticism from some quarters, people who questioned whether a former waitress could really manage a major cultural institution, who saw her academic credentials as tainted by the fraud accusations even though she had been exonerated. But she proved them wrong through expertise and determination, assembling a staff of talented curators and researchers who shared her passion for Japanese art and her commitment to making it accessible to Western audiences. Marcus surprised everyone, including himself, by becoming the partnership's strongest advocate. When board members on the Sterling Whitmore side expressed concerns about the cultural exchange program or the commitment to preserving the foundation, It was Marcus who argued most forcefully for staying true to the vision. He had spent 40 years building an empire on cold calculation and ruthless efficiency. Now, in what he privately acknowledged might be his last major deal before retirement, he wanted to build something that mattered beyond the numbers on a balance sheet. The merger was finalized in October, 4 months after that dinner at Ethelard. The integration process began immediately, bringing together two very different corporate cultures, with all the friction and frustration and occasional breakthroughs that entailed. Sophie learned to navigate boardrooms full of skeptical executives who saw her as too young, too idealistic, too willing to sacrifice short-term gains for long-term values. Elena built her programs and fought for her budget, and proved her worth through the kind of meticulous scholarship and passionate advocacy that had defined her career before it was stolen from her. And slowly, painfully, beautifully, the partnership began to take shape. Not perfectly, not without setbacks and conflicts and moments of doubt, but real and growing stronger. 6 months later, Sophie found herself in a very different restaurant on the other side of the world. The dining room occupied the 45th floor of a gleaming tower in Tokyo, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a spectacular view of the Imperial Palace gardens below. Their ancient trees and carefully tended paths, a reminder that some things endured across centuries. The atmosphere was warm and vibrant, filled with the sounds of respectful conversation and genuine laughter. The kind of celebration dinner where people actually enjoyed being together instead of just going through professional motions. The dinner brought together board members from both Nakamura Corporation and Sterling Whitmore, now officially merged into a single entity with a name that honored both legacies. The integration had not been easy. There had been conflicts over strategy and culture, misunderstandings born of language barriers and different business philosophies, moments when Sophie had lain awake at night wondering if they had made a terrible mistake. But they had worked through it, together, guided by the philosophy that had started it all. Sophie sat at the head of the large round table, but it did not feel like a position of dominance. It felt like the center of a community, a place where voices came together, rather than where orders were issued. Around her sat people who had become not just colleagues, but friends, partners in the truest sense of the word. Before the dinner, Sophie had called her father. It had become a daily ritual over the past 6 months. These conversations with James Sterling as he slowly, painfully recovered from the stroke that had nearly killed him. His speech was improving, the doctor said. Each week brought small victories, words that came a little easier, sentences that flowed a little more smoothly. When she told him about the celebration dinner, about the partnership that was thriving, about choosing to fly between the moon and the reeds just as grandfather had taught, he had wept. "Your grandfather would be so proud," he had managed to say, his voice still slurred but understandable, still carrying the love and validation Sophie had needed for so long. "I am so proud. You protected the heart. You protected it and made it stronger." It was the closure Sophie needed, the validation she had been seeking since that hospital room 6 months before. Her father understood now what she had fought for. He saw that she had not just defended his company, but had transformed it into something better, something worthy of the legacy he and her grandfather had built across 2 generations. Marcus Blackwell sat across from her, and the transformation in him over the past 6 months had been remarkable. He had thrown himself into learning Japanese with the same intensity he brought to everything else, and while his accent was still terrible, mangling tones and stumbling over particles, his vocabulary was growing and his determination was genuine. More importantly, he had begun to listen more than he spoke, to ask questions instead of giving orders, to admit when he did not understand something instead of pretending otherwise or dismissing it as unimportant. He had even begun taking his grandson, Brandon's young son, to visit traditional craft workshops on the weekends when the boy came to visit. It was an attempt to build the kind of relationship with the next generation that he had failed to build with his own son, to share knowledge and wonder instead of just demands and expectations. Sophie had seen photos that Marcus's assistant proudly showed around the office. A stern-faced CEO kneeling beside a small boy, both of them watching a master craftsman work with clay on a potter's wheel, both absorbed in the quiet magic of creation. Brandon, for his part, had taken a position leading the European division. The distance from his father was giving him space to breathe, to question, to develop his own leadership style away from the overwhelming shadow of Marcus's expectations. His recent quarterly reports showed a subtle shift in approach, fewer commands barked from on high, and more questions asked of the people who did the actual work, fewer assumptions about the superiority of the American way, and more openness to local practices and perspectives. It was too early to call it transformation, too soon to say that he had learned the lessons his father was now trying to teach. But Sophie had learned that sometimes the crane's flight path was not straight, that sometimes you had to circle and backtrack and try different directions before you found your way between the moon and the reeds. But the most remarkable transformation was Elena. She sat to Sophie's right, and she was glowing with the kind of quiet joy that came from doing work that mattered, from being seen and valued for who she truly was. Her exhibition, The Soul of the Machine, Hiroshi Nakamura and the Art of Modernity, had opened in New York 2 months ago to critical acclaim. The reviews had been extraordinary, praising not just the beauty of the pieces she had curated, but the intellectual framework she had provided, the way she had connected traditional Japanese aesthetics to contemporary questions about technology and humanity, and the search for meaning in a rapidly changing world. It was already being called a landmark event, the kind of scholarly work that would reshape how people understood the relationship between art and technology in post-war Japan. Universities were reaching out, asking Elena to give lectures and lead seminars. Publishers were offering contracts for her to turn the exhibition catalog into a full-length book. The academic world that had rejected her 5 years ago was now begging for her attention, her expertise, her validation. But Elena was careful about which invitations she accepted, which platforms she used her newly reclaimed voice to speak from. She remembered too well what it felt like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to have your work stolen and your reputation destroyed. And she was determined to use her position now not just to rebuild her own career, but to create space for others, especially women and people of color, who faced the same kind of institutional barriers that had nearly broken her. She had become Sophie's closest friend and most trusted advisor, the person Sophie turned to when she needed perspective on a difficult decision, or just someone who understood what it meant to feel caught between worlds. They spoke in Japanese when they wanted privacy, in English when they wanted to include others, and in the language underneath all languages, the one made of shared glances and knowing smiles, and the kind of understanding that came from having stood together when it mattered most. As the dinner progressed, the conversation flowing easily between Japanese and English, Sophie found herself watching the servers who moved between the tables with practiced grace. She saw in them the same careful invisibility that Elena had once worn like armor, the same quiet efficiency that allowed them to be present but not noticed, essential but not acknowledged. It made her chest tighten with a mixture of sadness and determination. One young server in particular caught her attention. He could not have been more than 20, fresh-faced and nervous, his movements careful to the point of rigidity. Sophie recognized that fear, that desperate hope of getting through the shift without making a mistake that would bring shame or anger or dismissal. She had seen it in Elena's eyes 6 months ago. She had felt it in her own heart during that endless dinner where every breath felt like it might be the one that shattered her composure completely. As he leaned in to pour wine into the glass beside Elena's plate, his hand shook. Just a tremor, barely noticeable, but enough. The bottle tilted too far. Red wine splashed onto the white tablecloth, a spreading stain that looked, in the candlelight, almost like blood. The young man froze, his face draining of all color. The entire table went quiet, conversations halting mid-sentence as everyone turned to look at what had happened. Sophie saw the panic in the young server's eyes, saw him open his mouth to stammer an apology, saw him brace for the humiliation that he clearly expected to follow, the harsh words or dismissive anger that would mark him as incompetent and careless. But Elena moved before anyone else could respond. She reached out and placed her hand gently over the wine stain, covering it with her palm as if to shield it from view. to protect this young man from the consequences of a simple accident, in the way that no one had protected her when she dropped things or made mistakes or failed to meet impossible standards during her own years of invisible labor. When she spoke, her voice was calm and warm, filled with a kindness that made Sophie's throat tighten with emotion and pride and love for this woman who had every reason to be bitter, but chose instead to be gentle. Mondai arimasen? Elena said in perfect Japanese, her Kyoto accent as refined and beautiful as it had been that first night at Ethelard. It is no problem at all. Ko yu koto wa okoru mono desu. Dere ni demo okoru koto desu. Shinpai shinaide kudasai. These things happen. They happen to everyone. Please do not worry. The young man stared at her, clearly expecting anger or contempt, or at the very least irritation. But he found none of those things in Elena's face. Just understanding, just compassion, just the recognition that he was a human being doing a difficult job, and that a small accident did not diminish his worth or justify cruelty. Sophie felt tears prick at her eyes as she watched this small moment of grace. Elena, who had spent 5 years being invisible, who knew exactly what it felt like to be dismissed and diminished and treated as less than human, was using her new position of power not to dominate but to dignify. She was breaking the cycle that had broken her, choosing kindness over cruelty, choosing to see someone who the rest of the room might have looked right through. The young server managed a trembling, "Arigato gozaimasu, thank you very much," his voice thick with relief and gratitude. He bowed deeply, more deeply than was strictly necessary for such a minor incident, and hurried away to get cleaning supplies. But his posture was different as he walked, Sophie noticed. Straighter, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Marcus caught Sophie's eye from across the table and gave a small nod of approval. He understood the significance of what had just happened. They all did. This was why they had chosen the harder path. This was what it meant to build a company, a culture, a way of being in the world that honored dignity and recognized worth in places where others saw only servants and tools and invisible labor. After the dinner wound down, after the speeches and toasts and promises of continued partnership, Sophie and Elena stepped out onto the restaurant's private balcony. The night air was cool and clear, carrying the faint scent of the cherry blossoms that would bloom in another month. The city spread out below them like a galaxy of lights, Tokyo in all its vast, complicated beauty, a reminder that there were other ways of being powerful than the cold, isolated dominance that Marcus had chased for 40 years. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, just breathing in the night air and watching the city live its life 45 stories below them. After 6 months of constant motion, of negotiations and conflicts and breakthroughs and setbacks, this quiet moment felt like a gift. "It is funny," Elena said finally, her voice soft and reflective. "For so long, a dinner like this was my prison. A place of stress and invisibility and aching feet and the constant fear of making a mistake. And now here I am, on the other side of the world, at a celebration dinner for work that I helped create, wearing clothes that fit and sitting at tables instead of serving them. And I feel like I can finally breathe, like I can finally be myself without apology." Sophie smiled, understanding exactly what she meant. You are not invisible anymore. You have a seat at the table, the one you always deserved, the one your expertise and integrity and courage earned for you. "We both do," Elena corrected gently, turning to look at Sophie with eyes that held 6 months of shared struggle and triumph. "You found your voice that night at Ethelard, Sophie, but I just gave you the language to speak it in. You were always strong. You were always your grandfather's heir. You just needed permission to believe it. And maybe I needed you as much as you needed me. 2 women learning to fly together." Sophie looked down at the crane and moon pin that she wore every day now, had worn through every meeting and negotiation and difficult conversation over the past 6 months. "He used to tell me that you have to fly between the moon and the reeds, that the secret to a meaningful life was learning to move between ambition and community, between achievement and connection, between success and soul. I was stuck for so long, afraid to fly at all, afraid that if I tried, I would fall, afraid that I was not strong enough or smart enough or worthy enough to carry his legacy forward. And what do you think now?" Elena asked softly. I think, Sophie said slowly, choosing her words with care, that flying is easier when you are not doing it alone, that having someone who sees you, who believes in you, who chooses to stand with you even when it would be easier to walk away, that makes all the difference. I think that power is not about dominance or control or making yourself big by making others small. It is about choosing to see the person right in front of you. Really see them, not as what they can do for you or what role they play or what category they fit into, but as a whole human being with knowledge and experience and value. She paused, then added, and I think that my grandfather was right. The moon is cold and lonely, but the reeds, when you share them with people who matter, when you build something together that has meaning beyond profit, that is where you find warmth. That is where you find home. Elena reached out and took Sophie's hand, squeezing it gently. You gave me back my life, Sophie, my work, my identity, my purpose, my belief that the world could be just and fair, and that truth mattered. I do not think I will ever be able to thank you enough for that. For seeing me when I had almost given up on being seen. For believing in me when I had stopped believing in myself. Sophie shook her head, her own eyes filling with tears now. You gave me mine. You showed me what it meant to have courage, to speak truth to power, to refuse to stay invisible even when the world was trying its hardest to erase you. You reminded me that I had a voice worth using. We saved each other, Elena, and now we get to build something together. Not just a company or a foundation or a partnership, but a different way of being in the world. They stood in silence for another moment. Two women from impossibly different worlds, bound together by an alliance that had been forged in crisis and tempered in the months since. They were not just colleagues anymore, not just partners in a business venture. They were friends, sisters, family, in the way that mattered most, the family you chose rather than the one you were born into. Below them, the young server who had spilled the wine was finishing his shift. Sophie could see him through the window, laughing with his coworkers, the earlier terror replaced by relief and gratitude, and maybe, just maybe, a small seed of hope that the world might be kinder than he had feared. One small moment of compassion had changed the course of his evening. Perhaps in some small way, it might even change the course of his life, give him the courage to believe that he was worth more than invisible labor, that his mistakes did not define him, that kindness existed even in places of power. We should go back in, Elena said eventually, though neither of them moved immediately. They will wonder where we went. But they stayed for just a moment longer, savoring this quiet instant of reflection before returning to the noise and warmth of the celebration, to the work that was still ahead of them, to the partnership they were still building one difficult conversation and one small victory at a time. Elena, Sophie said softly, yes? Thank you. For speaking to me in Japanese when I needed it most. For seeing me when I felt invisible. For being brave enough to tell your story, even though it hurt. For choosing to stand with me, even when you had every reason to protect yourself and stay silent. For showing me that being powerful does not mean being cruel. Elena's voice was thick with emotion when she replied, thank you for listening, for believing me when you had no reason to, for using your power to do something about an injustice instead of just feeling bad and moving on, for showing me that being seen is not just about being acknowledged, but about being valued for who you truly are. They turned and walked back into the warm light of the restaurant, back to the celebration, back to the work that was still ahead of them. But they walked together, side by side, equal partners in every way that mattered. And if the spirit of Hiroshi Nakamura was watching from wherever the dead go to watch the living, Sophie imagined he was smiling. His granddaughter had learned to fly between the moon and the reeds. She had built a partnership based not on dominance, but on respect. She had chosen the harder path because it was the right one, and she was not flying alone. In the end, this was not just a story about a business deal or a corporate merger, or even about two women finding their voices in a world that tried to silence them. It was a story about the invisible people who walk among us, holding entire worlds of knowledge and experience and wisdom that we overlook because we do not bother to truly see them. The waitresses and the janitors and the assistants and all the others who keep the machinery of our lives running while we take them for granted, treating them as furniture instead of human beings. It was a reminder that true power comes not from making yourself bigger by making others smaller, but from recognizing the inherent worth of every person you encounter and treating them with the dignity they deserve. That success, measured only in dollars and deals in dominance, is a hollow kind of victory that leaves you cold and alone at the top of a very tall building, with nothing but the view to keep you company. It was a testament to the fact that when the invisible finally choose to speak, when they find their voice and their power and their courage, the whole world has no choice but to listen. Because their stories matter, their expertise matters, their humanity matters. And the only reason they were ever invisible in the first place is because we chose not to see them. Sophie Nakamura Sterling and Elena Torres had both been invisible in their own ways, one dismissed because of her youth and her gender and her bicultural identity, one erased because her truth was inconvenient to someone with power and a fragile ego. But they had found each other in a moment of desperate need. They had chosen each other when it would have been easier to look away. They had stood together when standing apart would have been safer. And in doing so, they had changed not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone around them. They had shown that a different way was possible, that business could be done with integrity and respect, that power could be used to lift others up instead of grinding them down, that success did not have to come at the cost of your humanity or your values or your ability to sleep peacefully at night. The crane and the moon, ambition and community, achievement and connection. Flying between them was harder than choosing one or the other, yes. It required constant adjustment, constant vigilance, constant willingness to question yourself and admit mistakes and try again. But it was also the only way to build something that truly mattered. Something that would last beyond your own lifetime, something that future generations would look back on and say, yes, this is what it means to do it right. As Sophie and Elena rejoined the celebration, as they laughed and talked and planned for the future that they were building together, the city of Tokyo sparkled below them like a promise, like a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is light, that even when you feel invisible and voiceless and powerless, there is someone out there who will choose to see you if you are brave enough to let them. Someone who will hear you if you are brave enough to speak. Someone who will stand with you if you are willing to stand for something that matters. You just have to be brave enough to reach out, brave enough to trust, brave enough to believe that you deserve to be seen and heard and valued. And when you do, when you make that choice to truly see another person and to let yourself be seen in return, that is when the real transformation begins. That is when the impossible becomes possible. That is when the invisible finally steps into the light and claims the space they always deserved. And the world, whether it wants to or not, has to make room, has to adjust, has to recognize that power built on making others invisible is not power at all, but just a house of cards waiting for the right wind to blow it down. True power, lasting power, meaningful power comes from seeing and being seen, from lifting and being lifted, from choosing kindness when cruelty would be easier, from speaking truth when silence would be safer, from standing together when standing apart would be more comfortable. And that is the kind of power that changes the world.